closer you get to the wall, maybe I'll
But I can get my hands on
Locke's first day back.
it. Even when you're only looking. Above your head. No whiskey. Yeah. However, if you'd like to break out in song, now's the time.
Yeah.
That's fine.
They don't give places full stands. Get rails to do that.
So the hydrogen they mentioned with those condos.
I had to work on someone. Someone math I think published
C, B. How do I turn that on?
Well, I was talking with for one of them, and he's like, well, that number has kept going up. So maybe it's not done at 20 yet.
In the testing,
Can I go up and
All right, good afternoon. Why don't we go ahead and get started? Everybody is here. And we are online, correct? So as everyone knows, we are streaming this meeting. My name is Stephanie Cooper. I'm the Deputy Commissioner for Policy and Planning, and I'm pleased to welcome you to our second stakeholder meeting to guide MassDEP's development of a drinking water standard for PFAS. We met in April, and it has been a whirlwind couple of months, I'm sure for many or all of us, but certainly on this issue, we continue to spend a tremendous amount of time on it. So my role here is to welcome you as I am doing, and to speak louder. Yes, okay. I will be speaking louder now. Can everyone hear me? Okay, good. I am going to give you some brief updates and walk you through the agenda, and then I will, we'll take the program from there. I want to recognize Senator Jamie Eldridge, who has joined us here for today's meeting, and thank him for all the work that he has done on this issue, supporting several communities and water supplies in his district that have had PFAS detections last night at a meeting in Harvard, and then here it is today. So we really, really appreciate all your advocacy and support. So I'm going to go straight to this. So today's agenda, we're going to go through that, and you've all seen the agenda, I hope. We believe we've put together a good, set of topics that advances our work on the MCL and our guidance and input that we're looking for from all of you. We've also picked up on a couple of threads of the discussion from the last meeting, so we think that we've made time for the various issues that are of interest that people want to discuss. So like I said, I will be giving you sort of just catching you up from what we've been mainly working on since last time. I'm going to turn the program over to Assistant Commissioner Paul Locke and our Director of the Office of Research and Standards, Mark Smith. As you will recall, when we met last time, the department was about to file our draft regulations updating our hazardous waste cleanup regulations, which is a wholesale set of updates, but included in that is a proposed groundwater cleanup standard for PFAS. So since that draft is now out on the streets, and we're sort of in the middle of the public process, so we're going to tell you a lot about that, sort of the underpinnings for it, the types of feedback that we're receiving so far, and then dive deeper into what is the groundwater standard proposal based on. Then Damon is going to lead us through a discussion about various aspects of the MCL, various components, and you should all receive sort of guiding questions to sort of really delve into and focus on some aspects that we hope to really get some good feedback on and sort of flush out today. And then Doug is going to lead us through a discussion about a treatment technique approach, which is something that We know that certain parties are interested in the department pursuing further. It was part of the petition that we responded to in January. We touched on it a little bit last time, but we wanted to be sure we had more time to talk about it today. So we've allowed time for that. And then we will do next steps and just wrap up and figure out where we go from here. So that is our plan. As you all know, we are live streaming the proceedings, so there are people who are able to at least observe the proceedings today, and then afterwards, our practice, you may be aware, is to post the video of the meeting on the website so that people can review it after the fact. And you may have noticed that our meeting from April is posted there, so that's what we're going to be doing after the fact. I knew there was something big that I wanted to say, and what it is a staffing announcement that I wanted to make because it's relevant to this discussion. Many of you have gotten to know our Assistant Commissioner for Water Resources, Doug Fine, and spoiler alert, he is not going far, but I do want to let people know that he is transitioning within the department to take on another really important role overseeing our air and waste work in our central region, working out of Worcester. So as of this week, he'll be transitioning out of his water resources in Boston role into an air and waste role in Worcester. So this is the last time you'll see him in this capacity at this meeting. And we will soon have a new Assistant Commissioner for Water Resources to introduce you to, and we will have that announcement to make soon, but not today. So we just wanted you to know about that change. So, and also we really want to thank and recognize Doug for all of his work on PFAS, certainly, but on a whole range of issues. And so we're glad that he's continuing to serve the department in this important role. So with that, it's a little harder balancing with the microphone. Just in the category of sort of catching you up, some of you may have seen this map. I believe we showed it last time. It's on our website, and we continue to refine it. A, keep it updated if there are new PFAS detections, and B, to make the information sort of more clear and more granular. And I would just say sometimes I feel with GIS, the capabilities are so robust that you can sort of keep on refining it to a point that sometimes you don't recognize it. Hopefully we have not done that in this instance, but there's the key that is under the map lists all of the public water supplies where there have been PFAS detections, and there are 6 that have been above our current drinking water guideline, the 70 parts per trillion for the 5 compounds, and I believe there are 4 that have been above the 20, which is the proposed groundwater cleanup standard that we have now. And then there are 5 that have been below 20. But the real headline, the most important thing, is that all of them that have had detections have taken actions to address the conditions. So whether it's to shut off a certain well, to modify usage, or to blend the water so that any water that is available to the public is not above the 20 parts per trillion. And we've spent a lot of time working with water suppliers to achieve this, and I would say that they have also worked very hard 24 hours a day to accomplish that. As I think this group, who's very aware and cognizant of these issues, knows that firefighting foam, AFFF, is appears to be a primary source of this contamination, but we do have one likely manufacturing source that we're looking at as well. I think the only other thing I'll say about this map is that for each municipality we've added a number, which is the number of community water supplies that are in that community. And I think we'll have this posted on our website as of tomorrow, and it's an interesting it's interesting with the data, and I think we try to make it more granular so that you can see what are the types of community supplies and where the issues are. In terms of our activities, you're going to hear, as I noted, about a couple of areas in great depth. But as I just alluded to, we continue to support water, communities and water supplies where there have been detections, and that's been a lot of our time. And then we also, with that, if it's not immediately clear what the source of the contamination is, we also spend significant resources in investigating that so that we know about it and can deal with it and and address it quickly. We recently sent out 2 communications that are important. One was a letter from the commissioner just last week to all public water suppliers, urging them to undergo voluntary sampling for PFAS. We know that through this process, once we have a standard in place, there will be sampling that is required, but we feel that it is really important and will be very helpful to do sampling sooner than that, because as we've seen from the other places where we've had detections, when there's an issue, we can usually deal with it, but it's really important to know. So the commissioner really wanted to have that letter come from him and to go out statewide. And then the second thing we've done, I believe we may have referred to in our last discussion with this group, is that we've gone back to the water supplies that participated in a voluntary sampling effort that EPA runs called Unregulated Contaminant Monitoring Rule. Thank you. This is the third instance of it, so UCMR 3. That did sampling, it selected public water supplies across the state 3 years ago, and we've asked, at that time people were looking at 70 parts per trillion for 2 of the compounds, PFAS and PFOA, and we've asked those water supplies that participated to go back to the labs that did their sampling and to see if they can glean data at a lower reporting level to see if they have issues, let's say above 20. So that's another communication that we will put out. We continue to require sampling of any proposed new public water supply for PFAS, and we continue to require for wastewater residuals, for new applications for that activity, and for renewals we require sampling for PFAS as well. Lastly, we recently approved 6 labs under our regulations to be certified for PFAS sampling, and we know that that will be important as our program continues to move forward. I mentioned, asking water suppliers to do sampling statewide, and that they need to have certified labs to support that effort. So that's really important and something that we are focused on. So I believe with that, I'm going to turn the program over to our Assistant Commissioner, Paul Locke. And I should pause and just say, does anybody have any clarifying questions or anything that they want to say at the outset? And Senator, I should give you an opportunity to, because maybe you wanted to relate to this group.
No, thank you. Just be here to listen. Thank you very much for listening.
Okay. And also, I want to say thank you to everyone for taking the time to be with us here today. Thank you for the feedback that you've given us between meetings, for the feedback that you're going to give us today and going forward. And as you know, we're going to have a robust dialogue today. We also have opportunities for people to give us feedback. If there's information you find or thought that you have after the meeting, we'll show you how to do that. And then, of course, all of this is in advance of a rulemaking process that will be very robust with many opportunities for public comment, which is a perfect segue to you to talk about your rulemaking process, which is right in the throes of all that public comment.
There's actually a lot you said, repeating in throws of the public comment period for us. When you're busy out there writing comments, reading and understanding, you just get to sit around it when we do it. So this is the problem we was still on through this cleanup program. And this is the problem I want to see this still on. So what I want to talk about today is first give a brief background of the waste cleanup program. I know some of you are intimately involved in it and understand it very well. Some of you coming more from the water supply area, maybe less familiar with what we do under waste cleanup. So I have to be very, very short. This is what we do and how these, and it's important to understand how these standards fit in to the bigger process. So I'll talk about that, what we're doing with the standards, how they developed, not getting into the toxicity values and the risk assessment piece is kind of higher level part, and then talk about how all of this is related to PFAS and the public comments, and go over some of the public comments that we've already heard. So this is the simplest version of the waste cleanup program that I can describe. You start, that's notification to us. There's preliminary assessments, and then you do a more in-depth assessment. You select the remedy, you design the remedy, you implement the remedy, and then you stop. At any point, the system is set up so at any point along the way, once you have enough information to show that you're done, you can actually kind of somewhat short circuit the route. But this is the overall process. Study it, decide what you're going to do it, and then you're done. So what we have proposed in these draft regulations for PFAS are reportable concentrations and cleanup standards. The reportable concentrations come in at the start of the process. That's how we trigger notification. If people take samples of groundwater or their private wells or soil, say as part of their due diligence for property transfer, they come to have knowledge that there's been a release. If that release exceeds our reportable concentrations, they have to report. We also have reportable quantities for such spills. So this is the most common way that people actually start into the wayside cleanup program. There are other ways to get in, but this is the most common one. At the end of the process, we have cleanup standards. So these would be the remediation goals, what you would aim for to clean up. That if you meet these standards, it's one piece of the process to determine that you're done. There are other requirements. In addition, a major one being you have to eliminate or control all continuing sources. But we use the standards as really the goal. If you get everything below these standards, then you can say fairly confidently that you're done with the assessment and cleanup process. And the way the statute is written, the law is written, it's all tied to this concept of no significant risk. So the standard, to meet standards, is a way of showing that you have met this risk requirement, that the site and contamination from the site poses no significant risk. It's a jargon, but that's what the law says to define an endpoint as far as risk is concerned. And we have three ways of looking at risk. Method 1, Method 2, and Method 3. We're very creative in naming. The Method 1 standards are intended to be relatively simple, straightforward, relative to these methods, more conservative way of looking at the risk and looking at the cleanup requirements. So this is the very simple Form 1040, I think was originally when we did this. It's the easy form, the short form, the easy way of looking at the risk. You just compare what you have to the acceptable levels, and if you're below the acceptable level, you can say you're done. Method 2, which I've grayed out here because for our purposes it probably doesn't come into play that much, but it gives people the ability, the LSPs, the licensed site professionals who will be overseeing the cleanup work, the ability to kind of tweak some of those numbers based on site-specific factors. It gives a little bit of flexibility while still retaining kind of the ease and simplicity and economy and certainty of using clear published standards. Method 3 uses site-specific risk assessment. We have risk requirements, excess lifetime cancer risk of 1 in 100,000 and hazard quotient of 1. They just like risk levels. Those are actually the risk standards, and you can do a site-specific risk assessment at any point of the site to show that you have completed the process, that your site poses no significant risk. And a 1 in 100,000 or the hazard quotient of 1 is the definition of no significant risk. Overall, about 85% of the sites that we have close out using Method 1. Maybe 1 or 2% use Method 2, and the rest, which would be 13, 14%, it's hard doing math on your feet, close out using Method 3. Couple things. Method 1 and Method 2 are never required. People always have the option of doing the site-specific risk assessment. As a result, any standards on Method 1 can't be viewed as required target levels. People always have the option of doing a site-specific risk assessment. So what we're publishing, and what we're seeking comment on for the PFAS things, are Method 1 standards that people have the option of using. They also have the option of doing a site-specific risk assessment to determine this no significant risk. There's a little twist to this, that under Method 3, even when you're doing a site-specific risk assessment, if there are propagated standards that are applicable, suitably analogous, which is our term for what the federal government did the Superfund program calls ARARs. And we give 2 points if anybody knows what ARARs stands for. I think it's relevant. Oh, no. It's been a long time since I did it anyway. I've never heard of it. Applicant relevant and appropriate requirements. And it basically says that even if you're doing site-specific risk assessment, if there are promulgated standards out there, the 2020 program does not give you carte blanche to ignore the standards or not meet those standards. Those are rules or regulations. You still have to meet it. So anybody who's doing that through risk assessment still has to look at any applicable standards that you might apply in this situation. And we were talking about drinking water, water being used or protected for drinking water use. The MCLs are considered applicable to living standards. So the package together, what we're doing here from MLE and what we're talking about for this beginning of the future drinking water program, the way it affects our program in the ways of cleanup is that regardless of which method you would use, in the end, once we have an MCL, that will always be the target level, regardless of how much flexibility, regardless of which method you use. So how do we develop these standards? And we're going to focus on the drinking water related criteria. Keep in mind, if you do look at our regs, it's a whole, we have proposed standards for a whole bunch of different chemicals, not just PFAS. There are soil and different categories of groundwater that we're not going to talk about here, but it's in there as well, and a whole bunch of other things. So you're more than welcome to comment on all of it. But here, we're focusing on what we call GW1, category GW1 groundwater, which is groundwater that's currently used as drinking water or is being protected for its foreseeable future use as drinking water. More on that in a second. We also have standards for soil, for direct contact, kids that incidentally eat soil, construction workers that have soil on their skin, may incidentally ingest some. But also the soil standards have to be protective for leaching to groundwater. So those are kind of two factors we take into account, the direct risk and the indirect by the transfer from soil to groundwater. So that also has an effect here. So, and as I said before, we consider the drinking water program standards and guidelines as we go through this process. We do try to coordinate and have a consistent approach across the programs. Whether something is current or reasonably foreseeable use, these definitions are reasonably foreseeable, might be used in the future as drinking water. We look at a bunch of things. It's easier to determine if somebody is already using the water as drinking water. Those are kind of clear. If there's a public drinking water well, for instance, there's a zone 2, zone of contribution around those. Any groundwater which is within that zone 2 is considered GW1. All Class A surface water bodies, which are reservoirs that are used for drinking water. Interim multi-protection areas, which are the older version, simpler, there may still be some. And also for private wells. Any area, any groundwater that's within 500 feet of a private well is also considered GW1. So it's not just the public water we're concerned about, it's the water being used for private drinking. The potential drinking water source areas is far more interesting because it's trying to figure out what groundwater that is not currently being used as drinking water really needs to be protected for that purpose. The groundwater under this building is highly unlikely to be used for drinking water, and it is not GW1. You may be surprised. Where we do look for this, the first one is my favorite, which is that if you're a homeowner and you build a house and you are far away from a public water distribution line so that it's expensive to hook into public water, where are you going to look for your drinking water? Underneath. So the first criteria, one of the criteria, is that if you're more than 500 feet from a water supply distribution pipeline, that by definition is GW1. So that encompasses a large part of the state. Also, if a municipality enacts bylaws to protect groundwater for pollution to drinking water. We recognize that. And we categorize that as GW1 as well, with a caveat that's always pointed out that you need to check with the town that we don't necessarily have the current list of who has what bylaw and what we protect. And we also look for public water. Public water supply, you generally have to pump a lot of water. So that we're looking at potentially productive aquifers, those that have sufficient yield. You could pump out enough water to supply the town, or at least our municipal water supply. And there are exceptions, there are complications, but that gives you a general gist of what the GW category applies to. So we use this general framework for developing our standards since 1993. This is all online. There's a link there that you can look and look at the document that includes all of this, not only for the GW1, but for the soil standards and the other groundwater categories. The interesting thing about GW1 is that we have rule number one, which is if there is an existing MCL, Massachusetts MCL, or drinking water guideline, we will just adopt it as an MCP GW1 standard. Again, internal consistency, if it's being protected as drinking water, it doesn't matter if it's in the drinking water program or our program, we want to use the same numbers. In the absence of that, or kind of in this weird situation that we're in now, where there is a drinking water guideline, as you probably know, but we're in the process of reevaluating that across the programs. It's generally following the process below, which is looking at the potential cancer risks associated with exposure to these compounds, looking at the non-cancer and the cancer risk-based calculations to identify numbers that will be protective for both types of health effects. We take into account other factors like solubility, quantitation limits, and background levels, and to talk a little bit more about that. Solubility, if you run through these calculations, there are a few chemicals for which you go through the calculations and you find out that the number you calculated is higher than what you can actually get dissolved in water, which doesn't make much sense. So we lower the number to reflect the lower solubility. Quantitation, which we have in order for numbers to be useful and enforceable, we have to be able to measure it. So there are cases, and especially with PFAS, this is something that we continue to talk about. 1,4-dioxane is also a chemical. There are chemicals that have tricks to difficulties or issues, concerns. I'm sure what the recursion is. We want to be aware, we want to make sure that what we're proposing is standard is documented. And for some chemical background related to what part, that ways that clean up program related to releases to the environment, there are naturally occurring materials out there, particularly metals, where there are naturally occurring background levels that may become less. So we take all of that into account, and there are equations that we need. Not only is the documentation available to look at, but the Excel spreadsheets that goes through those calculations and all the exposure factors, all of that are available online to look. So, you know all of this now. You can hear what are we doing? The total concentration for the RCGW1, it's called, for groundwater we're concerned about. The drinking water, we're proposing is 20 parts per trillion for the sum of 6 PFAS compounds. It's the same value as the proposed groundwater 1 standard that would be used at the back end. So you come in, you go out using the same number. You actually apply them slightly differently, but numerical values are the same. And for the method 1 soil standards, so we refer to these S1 soil, think of as being residential, it's unrestricted use, kids could play in the soil. S1 soil / GW1, S1 GW1, it's S1 soil that's above a GW1 aquifer. S2 above the GW1 aquifer, S3 above the GW1 aquifer. Those are the 3 different soil categories. If it's above the GW1 aquifer, we want to make sure that the potential for leaching to that underlying groundwater is taken into account. And the number that we propose is 0.002 milligrams per kilogram, 200 nanograms per kilogram, and again, summing the same 6 PFAS compounds. This, which you probably can't read, don't worry about it. It's online. When we put out regulations in the waste cleanup program, partly because it's a very complicated set of regulations, and people coming to any individual section and look at it and say, why are they proposing this? We often have notes to reviewers that we insert in the proposed regulations to guide the reviewers in giving some background on why we're proposing this number, and in some cases asking specific questions that we're interested in. This is a gross summary of a page-long note to reviewers that's in our regs for the PFAS standards. And I would encourage you to don't rely upon this. I know it would be difficult to read anyway, which I'm not worried about it because I don't want you to base your comments on this. I want you to go to the actual regs, look at the page-long note to reviewers. But it's asking questions like, as basic as, do we have the right PFAS compounds for some? Should we look at individual standards? Should we look at different combinations? Should we look at different ways should we look at a combination of having individual standards plus some summation? Should we give more weight to what the EPA is doing? Are there other toxicity studies that have come out recently? There's something specifically about relative source contribution factor, which basically is asking, we're exposed to PFAS in other ways, not just drinking water. How can or should we take that into account in setting these standards? And the bottom line, which we talked a little about before, is can it be quantified? So there are a bunch of questions like this that we specifically are very interested in your comments, your thoughts. The public comments are due by close of business July 19th. Liz was here. Liz is there. Liz is in the back way behind Liz. There. They go to Liz Callahan at this address. I probably need to point out that this would be by mail. It is not postmarked by this date, but have it to us by that day. We take by email as well. So you have about a month to look at it if you haven't already. And the more important thing for you guys is that we have been and will continue to share any comments that we receive on PFAS through the MCP process with the Drinking Water Program and with the Office of Research and Standards for their work in looking at the potential MCL and revisions to the ORS guidelines and all of the work that goes into all of it. So that, again, we want to have one consistent way of looking at PFAS across the programs with all of this work we've done sometime, whatever it is. Our regs, this portion hopefully will be done probably in the fall of 2019. There are other things in addition to PFAS in it that also have to be finalized. So there's a lot of work to be done, which is what we're doing in common. So I've included a kind of laundry list that is not intended to be complete. I've tried to make it representative roughly of the type of questions we've been getting. And I don't want to go through each and every one of these, but you can look at it at your leisure. We'll be putting it up online, different slides. But the types of comments that we've been getting have been, PROS limit is appropriate for cleanup. Or there's no safe limit for PFAS. This is inappropriate. People concerned about PFAS and hotspots or clusters of different potential health outcomes, including people with chronic MS. Somebody noted that the EPA uses a 300-fold safety factor in developing their RFP. So that really, given that context, is there really a difference between our 20 proposed and EPA's current 70? Is an extra safety factor really necessary? People have said, you're looking at 6. We'd really like at least 14, and if you could do it, the whole class. One person said, PFAS, as you said, doesn't really interact a lot with things. It's a very stable compound, so does it really have an effect on people's health? Doesn't it just like attach to your blood and stay there innocuously? So maybe a higher standard might be appropriate. People concerned about recharge, ponds that recharge groundwater and flow in and out of the ponds and back into the groundwater, and what that might say about the proposed GW3 standard, which is actually kind of a discharge surface water body issue. Potential ecological effects. People have asked for support for money made available to towns to deal with PFAS, and these are the type of things that we pass on. It's a comment that isn't directly relevant to waste site cleanup regulations, but it's something that we are taking available, making everybody else aware of. That's where we get it. Single source aquifer should have higher protections. Source partitioning, contaminated soil, we have concerns. Somebody pointed out there was a recent Vermont background study, and we should look at that. Concerns about exposure to birds, surface water, potential PFAS in vegetables and fruit. I like the comment, wherever there is water, there is PFAS. So you don't get extra credit for pithy comments and well-worded comments, but they will be appreciated. And then a helpful thing for the park to talk about, people tell about the movies. Whether it's city comments, services, the way that program, I think I can generalize overall. And it's very helpful to have more specific comments. They helpful to us. A comment to the effect of, this number is not protected enough, or this number is overprotected, is a sentiment, it's a belief, but it doesn't give us a lot of information in order to adjust the numbers. What is very helpful is reference to 70s, and in some cases, maybe not the number like this, but also in CCP, if there are different ways of phrasing the language that we propose, it's always helpful to give it to us, because it will be more likely to understand what your point is, and be able to evaluate it and incorporate it if we agree with it. It's going to be back, step back, and just kind of express broader feelings about what way it should work. It's harder to us both from a stand, but we really can't get at. But also that we have to ability to manage ourselves, and there's potential for not getting it right. So the more detailed, the better, and we really appreciate that kind of thoughtful comment. And with that, do you have any questions? Yes.
So in reverse, the MCL informs the RC. Because that's not what's happening here, can you speak to the likeliness of whatever number you end up coming up with for the RC, that just becoming the MCL number?
So the question was, this is slightly the process I described, which is quite fit to what's going on here. It's unusual for all of this to keep going on. Usually it's just us changing the regs, or if we want to change the regs. And then the other is a catch up, or we make the catch up to that. The question is, what's the likelihood of you go out with the RC? It's 20, our number is 20. How likely is it that will become almost by default the MCL? And what we have pivoted to, we have to think, the way I think of it is that we have to start somewhere. And the way I think of it with this, with our rate package, and we get a little work on some of these levels. And we have to start getting comment. We have committed, our program has committed to first, take that first step, provide the information. We view this as a valuable information gathering process. And whatever number we end up with the default 2019, we will slowly be participating with the drinking water program and the MCL development process. And any information that feeds into that as well. We have committed to kind of follow along with the drinking water program, and should the department, and it's not just one program or the other, it's not, their program, our program, it's the department is looking at this and trying to figure out what the right number is. And if in December the department decides that 11,27,000 something is the appropriate number, then the waste cleanup program will follow along with the drinking water program and adjust our numbers. So we are not looking at it as we're setting a system and follow along with us drinking water. We will continue to participate in the process, and in the end, even if we have to go out for public comment and change our regulations, we're willing and ready to do that, and we'll make that process as well.
We're just asking people on speak, could you introduce yourself?
Okay, Alyssa Raymond Reed. Oh,
And since you're right up front.
hi, Alyssa Raymond Reed from Conservation Law Foundation. Just asking you to summarize that, what you just said. So there will be.
You try summarizing.
Well, it sounds like you're saying you're going to come up with a number now, place to start, but there will be a the apple, we have no information.
Yes.
Okay.
I wouldn't say the other by the apple, I would predict it. But we were, this is the information coming in fast and furious. And if you quickly time it, I said, okay, what are we going to have? And what should the number be? But that doesn't mean that a few months later, there's something that something else should be done.
More information.
And if the MCL is different, and if the MCL ends up being different from the waste cleanup standard, the waste cleanup standard will be adjusted to be the same as the MCL.
Okay.
Hi, Steve Olson. How many waste site standards do you have that don't reflect an MCL right now?
Right now we have, I think about 112, 114 generic MCP, that's one standard. The drinking water program has
On the order of 80 MCL?
80 MCLs. So there are a number of which we have, let's do this tabulation process, and it's set up the MCP standard.
Jen Peterson, Waterworks. Question about the analytical capabilities in soil. Is there approved methods? How are you looking at that? And then you had mentioned background. So how are you factoring background issues into that?
So first, the methods of soil. There are no, well, let's start with there are no certified methods of soil. Here are our last certified methods of drinking water. What we look at would be standard methods that EPA puts out, adopts, or other places, other regulatory agencies, but mostly EPA. And EPA has been in development, has been developing methods, a variety of methods of looking at PFAS, both in soil and media, all of that. That's part of why we're asking questions about analytical capabilities here. And we have gotten some comments already about what can be done on the soil. So it's a fluid situation, and we're waiting to see kind of what happens with it. And we're also working fast. Maybe obviously we're also just to be clear. We did just come up with a number. We did talk with a number of labs, a number of those proposed. But it is certainly opportunity for people, laboratories, other regulatory agencies, the world to comment on whether that is routinely able to be done at that level and what the analytical capabilities are and where we should go with it. And as for background, the way we typically look at a background, sort of set up with PFAS for a second, and let's take a background, and that is not this background chemical. There is not, right? Well, even let's take a look at this one, arsenic. Massachusetts, arsenic is it's a common element in the environment. It's there. It's naturally occurring. It's not released to the environment. We don't have regulatory authority, legal authority to require cleanup beyond background. It's not released to the environment. So we have to take that into account. So we try to identify what are the naturally occurring levels that are out there. and we will adjust the method one standard. If the calculated value falls below the naturally occurring one, then we will adjust the level up to the naturally occurring level to show that this is where remediation can stop. If you achieve naturally occurring background currents, you're done in our eyes. There's also concepts like historic fill and anthropogenic background. There are features, aspects of our law and regulations that recognize that there are some things that have been generally used and released in the environment, if you want to use that word, over the last 400 years. 400 years here. Particularly burning wood creates ash, which is rich in PAHs, polynuclear aromatic hydrocarbons, and at some point our program is not cleaning up those 400 years of history of heating our homes with wood. So we try to reflect that as well. So there are nuances like that that we'll do. We were asking the question for PFAS because it's become to us to ask and see if there's any data out there. I would not venture to say at this point whether we would incorporate some explicit background or whether we should, but it's something we can hear from people. Thank you. Mark Smith from our Office of Research and Standards.
All right, so MassDEP was more like the top-skill champion pumpkin that we're trying to find into big and not very chewable. So I'm going to provide a little bit of an overview on that. We're going to 20 parts per trillion and try to give everybody a bit of a flavor for where that value came from, whether it was too high values, too high, too low. Hopefully everybody gets some insight into the thinking that went into our arriving at value. So as an overview, I'll talk a little bit about big picture health concerns associated with these compounds. I think probably everybody in this audience is well aware of what those are. Just to sort of set the stage for why we're worried about these compounds in drinking water in the first place. Quick overview of the current ORSG, that's our state drinking water guideline, Office of Research and Standards guideline for drinking water. An overview of the process that's used to derive these drinking water guidelines at a fairly high level without going into a huge amount of detail, including how we derive the various toxicity values that we apply in this calculation. A quick summary, and this is going to be a complicated table, but we won't spend a lot of time on it, about where other agencies, not here in Massachusetts, but other state agencies and federal agencies have come down on drinking water values for these compounds. A quick summary of the key elements in our updated ORS assessment where we derived the 20 parts per trillion value, that MCPGW1 value, some conclusions, and then hopefully some time for questions. All right, so the health risk concerns, and again, I'm sure everybody knows these compounds can cross the placenta. Therefore, there are fetal exposures that are of concern. And in fact, you see that developmental risks are one of the endpoints that we are particularly concerned about with respect to exposures to these compounds. They're also expressed in breast milk. So nursing is another pathway of exposure that's of concern. So the infant neonate is a particular concern to us. These compounds are slowly excreted from the body, so in addition to being very persistent in the environment, once they're released into the general environment, once you take them into the body, they last a long time. So for the compounds we're focused on, the serum half-life estimates range from 1 to 8 or more years, so it's really a long time. So that enhances our concern about these compounds because they're not cleared particularly quickly from the body. These are amongst some of the more slowly excreted compounds that we deal with. Risks that we're concerned about, as I mentioned, include risks to the fetal development, including developmental delays, effects on bone development, variable mammary gland development, and liver development. There have also been studies documenting reduced immune responses to vaccine in children and some modest minimal reductions in birth weight that have been associated with these compounds as well. Endocrine disrupting thyroid hormone effects have been reported now in a number of animal bioassay studies. And there are elevated risks of cancer associated with cancers of the kidney, the testes, from some human studies, epidemiological studies, and pancreatic cancer from animal bioassays. So there are a fairly wide range of health effects that we are concerned about. All right, so the current Massachusetts guideline, we adopted this in June 12, 2018. In essence, what we did is we adopted the EPA Health Advisory, which was developed by EPA for PFAS and PFOA, which was very extensively and well documented and well supported. Our view, however, was that there were additional compounds that were of concern that were included in that UCMR3 testing protocol that Stephanie mentioned earlier. So we were asked to address these other compounds, my office of Research and Standards, because we were getting test results from some water supplies in Massachusetts where these things were showing up. So the question was, if they're there, should we be concerned about them or not? So we took a pretty deep dive look at the literature and research on this. And we concluded, for a number of reasons, that these closely related compounds, PFHXS, PFHPA, PFNA, were structurally very similar, exhibited similar half-lives and similar toxicity profiles, and therefore we thought they should be treated the same as PFAS and PFOA, and we included them in our guidance value. So this is the same approach that's been used by Connecticut, or is being used by Connecticut, and also Vermont. Vermont is currently using 20 parts per trillion. Connecticut is at the 70 parts per trillion, which is our current guideline. This value was reviewed and unanimously endorsed by a standing committee of scientists and public health experts, our Health Effects Advisory Committee in 2018. Shortly after we issued this guideline on June 12th, end of the month, the AGSDR issued their cost profile for fluorinated compounds. And we'll get to that in a minute. But basically, their report suggested that lower values might be appropriate. So what are the steps that we take to derive a drinking water value and guideline standard here? So in essence, there are a number of different components that go into these calculations. One needs a toxicity value, which is a measure of the potency of the compound. The EPA terminology for that toxicity value is a reference dose, or RFD. The ATSDR, which is another federal agency that does toxicity evaluations, they term these minimum risk levels, MRLs, but they're basically the same thing. And there are measurements of dose in typically milligrams per kilogram per body weight per day that are anticipated to be without an appreciable risk of deleterious effects during a lifetime of exposure. These values can also be used and applicable to shorter-term exposures when you've got a concern about a developmental endpoint, as you do for these compounds. And then you have to consider, and I'll also note here that the EPA definition also notes that these have an associated uncertainty spanning perhaps an order of magnitude. So that would be square root of 10 below the value, square root of 10 above the value. So in that range, EPA estimates that the true value would lie. In order to calculate a drinking water value from that toxicity value, you need to identify who your most susceptible subgroup is. It can be an adult, lactating woman, or an infant. EPA chose in their health advisory development process to focus on lactating women. We did the same. And a water consumption rate appropriate to the group that you're looking at. So lactating the woman would drink about 3.2 liters per day. That's the value that we've used. And this term, relative source contribution, that Paul mentioned that we were eliciting specific comment for in the MCP public comment process, EPA used 20%. This means 20% of that sort of allowable or target dose to come from drinking water, allowing 80% of it to come from other sources of exposure. And we know for these compounds that we are exposed to these things in our diets, food, home products, consumer products, etc. So we have used 20% as well. So those are the components, and what's important to note here is depending upon which of these values you choose in your calculation, you'll come up with a different output, a different health advisory value, a different drinking water value at the end of the process. So how do we derive the toxicity values? And I'm focusing in on this because we are in fact using a different toxicity value in our new proposal than the EPA value. We look at all of the data that's available. I shouldn't say all of it because this is a constantly changing and evolving data set. We try to keep up with it, but we're probably a little bit behind in terms of the data that's out there. But we look at the human data, the epidemiological studies that are out there. For those of you familiar with this, epidemiology is a pretty crude tool in terms of its sensitivity to detect effects. We're not doing experiments on people. This is what people are experiencing in their general lives, and then try to tease out what effects are associated with various exposures. The animal data, typically from rodent bioassays, but there may be other sources of data as well. And then other classes of data, which could include in vitro data, which is sort of laboratory data, test tubes, petri dish, understanding of the mechanisms of action, for which we don't have a really great understanding, with these perfluorinated compounds, structure activity relationships which relate to this reader class, which is to use data from structurally similar compounds to provide information about a compound that have less information. And in essence, that's sort of what we've done in combination with looking at the animal data. So we evaluate, toxicologists evaluate the studies and the endpoints for the quality of the study and assess the dose response of information, and then select what's known as a point of departure. This term will come up in a few slides later. POD, we call it a point of departure, which is the lowest dose at which a relevant adverse response occurs in the test animal, typically is what we're looking at here. And then you have to extrapolate those results from the animals to people. And there are a bunch of different variety of techniques for doing that. In this case, a pharmacokinetic model, a fairly sophisticated model, is used to extrapolate the serum concentration that are observed in the animals to people. You have to do that because the rodents, animals, clear this stuff much more quickly than humans do. So our long-term dose, once we're exposed to this, is much longer, much greater than what the animals experience. There are some other approaches, including allometric scaling, which EPA used in their proposed GenX and PFAS values, but we're not going to get into that. And then appropriate uncertainty factors, sometimes referred to as safety factors, are applied to account for the fact we have fundamental scientific uncertainty about how the results in the animals would relate to sensitivity to people to derive a final toxicity value. All right, so different agencies have made different choices in terms of which parameters they've used to derive their drinking water value. So EPA Health Advisory said it's a sum of two for PFAS and PFOA. As we mentioned, after we issued our ORSG, ATSBR came out with a report with lower toxicity values, more stringent toxicity values, which if you use the same exposure parameters that EPA applied in their health advisory derivation, you would come up with values about 10 times lower for PFAS and PFOA, 7 to 10 times lower. They also derived values for PFNA and the hexasulfate. Now, a number of other states have done more recent assessments and evaluations than the EPA health advisory, and the numbers are displayed here. As I noted, MassDEP is currently at 70, and we're proposing to go, our ORSG, we're proposing to go to 20 for the GW1 standard, which is a drinking water appropriate standard. Currently, we're addressing 5 compounds, and we're proposing to add a 6th, and I'll explain that in a moment. Most states are relying on EPA value of 70. Again, most states haven't done a deep dive looking at this. The states that have, by and large, have moved towards lower numbers. I'll note that New Hampshire has a proposed MCL value. They're supposed to come out with revised values very soon, in the next few days, and purportedly they will be lower than what's on this table right here. I don't know how much lower, but I've been told that they will be considerably lower. So New Hampshire is also moving towards lower numbers. And as I mentioned, Vermont is also summing across the same 5 covered by our current guideline at a target of 20, and that has been legislatively mandated at this point. All right, so the basis of the GW1 standards. First of all, why the compounds? Why this list of compounds? Where did we come up with these? All right, so the current ORSG, as I've already mentioned, In that UCMR3 testing, there were 6 PFAS compounds that were covered, that were addressed. We are addressing 5 of those in our ORSG. That's the 5 longer chain compounds. PFAS, which is a 4-carbon shorter chain compound, which is much less persistent in the human body and much less toxic based on the available information, was not included in our target list for the ORSG, current ORSG. So that's how we selected those 5 compounds. And again, we're treating them the same based on their being very similar in chemical structures, having long half-lives, similar toxicity endpoints, and where the data is available, similar potencies. In our update, we looked at the compounds that are covered in EPA that had 537. We used as a cutoff here 6 to 8 compounds with 6 to 8 carbons in chain length. So again, very similar to PFAS and PFOA, so plus or minus 2 from those compounds. One compound that falls into that category is the hexaacid. We did not include that because a preliminary look at the toxicity information indicated it's considerably less toxic and less persistent in the body, so it was not included in our revised proposal for the MCP GW1. This results in the same original 5 compound plus that PFDA. So that's the 10-carbon chain compound. So that sort of gives you an explanation for how we've landed up at these compounds. That's not to say that we have absolutely no concerns about any of the other ones. We do, but they're probably going to have different toxicities in terms of comparison to PFAS and PFOA, and we really couldn't justify treating them the same based on the information that we had available. All right, so what did we do for toxicity values? When we looked at the literature again after ATSDR came out with their report, it was pretty clear that there were multiple effects that were reported in literature studies on animals, bile acid, that were occurring at lower exposure levels than EPA used as that point of departure in their RFE derivation. All right, so that indicated to us that maybe that EPA value wasn't sufficient to help protect for PFAS and PFOA. So for PFAS, the endpoints that have the lower exposure levels with toxicity being reported include immunotoxicity effects, effects on the liver, the thyroid, and some of the developmental effects, in particular on skeletal abnormalities. So a number of effects. For PFOA, again, there are a number of developmental effects that have been reported at lower concentrations than that point of departure chosen by EPA, including effects on the mammary gland and liver, effects on thyroid hormone production, and on the liver. So our updated toxicity values. All right, so we're not the only ones coming up with lower toxicity values for these compounds. Point that out. ATSDR did, so there's another federal agency, released their draft values. But a number of the other state agencies that have looked at this have come up with lower RFB, lower toxicity values for these compounds. Some of them selected one particular study and an endpoint from one study to use as a POD, a point of departure, to generate a lower value. Others applied an additional uncertainty factor to account for the fact that there's a lot of data out there suggesting greater toxicity, but without putting too fine a point on it. Some use a factor of 10, some use a square root of 10. Those are sort of the 2 standard options that can be applied here. So there are examples of both. When we looked at it, we decided that the uncertainty factor approach made the most sense from our point of view, and we applied that to the US EPA RFE derivations, which we thought were, again, very well documented and a strong basis for starting point. And again, this is an approach that has been used by ATSDR and some other agencies, and it is consistent with EPA guidance on how one can do this. We took this approach, again, because there are multiple studies that raised concerns about effects at lower doses of exposure. But when you look at each individual study on its own, there are uncertainties in either the studies or in the interpretation of the results of those studies that limited our confidence in selecting those as a point of departure, specific point of departure for calculating a new RFD. So we thought the uncertainty factor approach was an applicable approach reflective of the data. All right, so what about the other compounds? Well, we certainly looked at the other compounds. PFNA, there is some limited half-life, serum half-life data, which demonstrates that the serum half-life is similar or perhaps a bit longer than PFOA, which is a structurally related compound. Animal estimates are in fact longer for this compound, which we would predict on the basis of its carbon chain length. Limited toxicity data, but there is some toxicity data. And for agencies that have used that toxicity data to derive a value, it comes out to be very similar to PFAS and PFOA. Within a factor of probably 20-30%, which we think is equivalent. So we're treating that the same as PFAS and PFOA, and it's a data-driven number. Hexasulfonate, the half-life data is pretty good for the hexasulfonate and demonstrates sort of surprisingly that it's longer than PFAS, even though it's one carbon shorter, which is kind of not expected, but that's what the data indicates. The toxicity value that's available is more extensive than for the other three compounds on this chart, but considerably less extensive than for PFAS and PFOA. So it's really hard to compare endpoints one compound to another. So pending more robust data, our decision was at this point to do this read across from PFAS, which is the most structurally similar compound, and treat it the same. And basically, to summarize, it's the same for the hepta acid and the PFBA. The hepta acid, very little toxicity data. Based on the structural similarities, we would expect that the T-half half-life would be shorter, and there's some very limited data suggesting that that is the case. Very little comparable toxicity data for that compound. And again, so pending more robust data on those issues, we decided to treat it the same. And then the DECA, the 10, there is half-life data that's limited, but again, suggested to be longer than PFNA and PFOA, the structural analogs for that compound. Little toxicity data, but what's available indicates it's similar to PFNA. So we are now applying the structural read across to treat it the same as PFAS and PFOA. So that's how we get to the point of summing across all 6 of these compounds using the same toxicity value. All right, what about the exposure parameters? Well, in our original RSG, we relied on the values that were selected and used by EPA in our health advisory derivation, and we have continued to do that. So the body weight and water intake rates of the nursing mother, relevant source contribution factor of 20%, and we are expanding or extending the EPA activity approach that they applied only to PFAS and PFOA to the full 6 compounds that I've been talking about. And we have tried to elicit comments in the MCP public comment process on whether these are appropriate assumptions or not. So conclusions, using the revised toxicity value of RFD that we've developed and applying the EPA exposure parameters in relevant source contribution term, the derived drinking water value comes in at just below 20 parts per trillion, which we would round to an insignificant figure, which leads us to 20 parts per trillion. And this would be applicable to the 6 compounds. This is the same value that Damon's at. We got there through a different process, but we're, at least we have 2 states that have consistent numbers, unlike lots of other states where the numbers are all over the place. So the next steps, as Paul indicated, we're soliciting public comment through the MCP process. We are also eliciting technical input from our Health Effects Advisory Committee, standing committee that I mentioned before. We've had 1 meeting of that committee where they supported the approach underlying the ORSG before we came out with that. And they continue to support the approach that we're taking now. They've requested some additional analysis and clarification information that we presented to them, and we're in the process of working that up. And that's it. If anybody has any questions, I'll do my best to address them.
Can you speak to the dose response curve? Is it steep for people?
It depends on which endpoint you were looking at. I give an example. The NTP completed a 28-day rodent study, and the most sensitive endpoint in that study is thyroid effect data. And the effects on the thyroid hormones in that study for all these compounds except the peptide acid, which is not included, is very steep, which makes doing the dose response analysis somewhat challenging because we really don't have appropriate doses in that low response range to really characterize the dose response particularly well.
So, to make sure I understand, what it means is that you can't, you have to go by the most sensitive receptor, and there's a big swing.
There in some of the endpoints, there is a big swing. I think that would be a reasonable way of saying it, yes. Any questions?
This is Mario from Clean Water Action. I'm wondering, I know as an advocate, I'm struggling keeping up with the data, and so I would like to understand what DEP's process has been for gathering new information, and I'm also wondering whether or not we couldn't have access to what's currently informing your decision making so that we know whether or not we're looking at the same sets of data.
So, did everybody get the question? So, how are we keeping up with the data and what data we're looking at? So, first of all, we're not de novo repeating all of the assessments everybody else is doing. So, we're starting out by looking at what the other states are doing, what EPA is doing, ATSPR is doing, there's some things that happen in the EU, we have reports from the EU that we're looking at. And then there's some new studies that we've been looking at, including that NTP 28-day study, which is basically just a huge dump of data. And we can certainly share all of that with you and make that all available.
So I'm curious then, if you're looking to other states, why is the proposed MCL number currently higher than some other states' recent decisions?
Right. So, yes, actually, go ahead. Question number one, are we really higher? I'm not sure, but most other states, except Vermont and Connecticut, are taking these one at a time. They're not summing across the compounds. They're assuming that Minnesota is sort of summing them, but assuming different relative frequencies when they do it. Right? So it's not, it's sort of comparing apples and oranges, or pumpkins and oranges. So I really can't say for sure that we're less stringent or more stringent. If you isolate a particular compound, then yeah, for some of them we'll be less stringent if that's the only thing that's showing up in your water. And there may be circumstances, in particular with an industrial source, where that could happen. Most of the data we see multiple compounds showing up. Yes.
I have a sort of related question to what Mario was asking about with this chart in particular, because I've seen this chart floating around at a number of presentations. How are you updating that? So it's sort of the similar question of how are you keeping track of state regs and legislation, and also when you're talking to other state regulators or maybe lawmakers generally, are you hearing about things that are bubbling up but not yet making it onto this chart, and finding out what people are basing their proposed draft changes, if they're in process, kind of where they are in a process?
I think that right now, with the exception of New Hampshire, that will be changing there very soon, that this is up to date.
Okay.
How do we keep up with it? Because I spent all my time with PFAS and on the PFAS conference call. We had one this morning, which was a new work group conference call talking about what the states are doing. So, I think it's pretty much up to date. Now, I will mention that there are some states that have values. Texas has some values. I don't really understand how they came up with them, so I didn't put them on the chart. Alaska, I think, has some values, but we haven't been able to get the documentation for how to provide them. Michigan just came out with values. They were not included in our original assessment. We're now looking at those.
Is anyone else any other state having a parallel process the way that we are here, that you are doing, with the sort of the waste site cleanup and the MCL development at the same time?
I don't not know where, but I wouldn't.
I think the Vermont number was initially a groundwater number.
Still is.
Yeah.
It's a groundwater discharge number, the Vermont number.
Yeah,
So,
but they just adopted legislation.
Right.
Legislatively applies.
Right. So that.
but it's guideline. It's still not an MCL. though.
It's still not from the MCL.
So they're beginning the process in Vermont to develop an MCL.
And then in New Jersey, I'm not sure how they're coordinating programs.
Can I just add on the it is hard. So it is a challenge to keep up with the data and the reports and what other entities are developing for standards. So to the extent any of you hear about new standards being promulgated or new reports coming out, you can just send them to that drinking water email. It's the last slide here. And we will follow the breadcrumbs and try and get to it. And better still, give us a link to an actual, proposed rule somewhere or a final rule somewhere.
I actually have two relatively related questions. I didn't want to stop you on your way. You were. Oh, sorry. Kristen Mello from Westfield, Massachusetts, from Raft. My questions were first, when you were talking about PFAS and PFHXA and how their toxicity and half-lives were different, how do they, if they don't compare to PFOS and PFOA well, how do they compare to other persistent toxic compounds that we might know about? And then I have a follow-up.
Okay. Yeah, and the short answer is we haven't really looked at that closely at this point. That's sort of the next on the shelf in terms of taking a look at some of these other compounds once we get through this. Half-lives are still fairly long for those compounds. I mean, they're probably in the range of months as opposed to years, weeks to months. But, that's still not a trivial half-life
right.
In terms of comparing to most other compounds. Less than PCBs and dioxins, but more than a lot of other things. So I wouldn't say they're not a concern, but they're sort of a different box in terms of level of concern than these other long-term ones.
Right.
At least from our perspective.
Right, okay. I just thought it might be helpful for the people that aren't, as far down the rabbit hole as some of us are, to be able to compare it to something else that is commonly we're aware of, like maybe commercial products and whatnot. We'll look it up if we have to. And on your slide that talked about how drinking water standards were, the little equation, I'm wondering where in that equation is the factor for community members that have suffered long-term chronic high-end exposure. So if we're looking for, you were talking about, some people look at 70 kilogram male, adult, and some people look at infant exposure. Where's the factor for communities with generational PFAS drinking water exposure, and how are these standards going to be protective of our communities, where our numbers have been high for so long and we don't even know what's in our blood. So if we institute an MCL, how are we going to make sure that that MCL allows us to have our numbers come down? And if it's not in that equation, can we add it?
It's not in that equation, I'm not sure. I mean, it's an intergenerational risk. It's a good issue, and I don't really know how we would necessarily account for that. I think at a 20 part per trillion level, if you had been previously exposed to values above that, your level would come down. That's been sort of a documented trend in situations where drinking water exposures has been remediated and resolved, blood levels come down over an extended time frame because there's long half-lives. But it does come down. So I guess I don't have a good answer to how you would factor in the intergenerational risk issue.
Can we please keep that annotated in this proceeding, because I think for a lot of Americans that's really going to matter to these numbers. And thank you.
Thank you.
So the RFP values that were used by EPA, so clearly the RFP values they used for PF1 and PFOS were much lower. Exactly how much lower was it compared to EPA's, and was that based on newer toxicology data?
So we applied an additional database on certain factor of square root of 10, 3.33. So our value is 3.33 lower than EPA's RFP.
Where did that 3.33?
Well, that came through our evaluation of all of the studies that indicated that there were effects reported and observed at lower exposure, lower dose levels in the animal studies that were not accommodated or accounted for in the EPA value. Yep. Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah.
Kind of going off of what you were saying.
I didn't hit it so well last time. So I hear there's a wide variety of response, species to species, and as well as within species. So it must make it very hard to find like the lowest adverse response level, correct?
No, I wouldn't say it's all that hard to identify. You look at the studies and you can see where those are. The hard point, or hard part, is determining whether or not a particular low response level is actually of concern to people.
We're tending to be very conservative and
I would say we're being reasonably conservative. One could be more conservative, one could be less conservative. You know, it really depends. You know, I'll note the EPA definition of the RFD, that order of magnitude. So we've gone from their value to the lower end, still within that range, that order of magnitude range. So we're still in the ballpark of the original EPA value, but now on the lower end of it. Let's go over here.
So question on, it seems to me that you're basing most of the others on sort of how you're looking at PFAS, PFOA. Have there been any human studies on PFOA?
Numerous.
Numerous?
Yeah.
And you can provide those as they asked?
Yeah. I mean, most of the studies on PFAS and PFOA, the ethics studies, have been summarized in the EPA analyses, and New Jersey did a great job on it. And the most recent summaries are in the EFSA EU report, where they actually derive an RFD value based on human epidemiological data, which is somewhat a matter of debate right now, whether what they did is appropriate. It's actually lower than it was. Yes.
Follow-up question on human studies.
Yep.
Any sense of the ratio of all the studies, how many or what ratio is human versus other species? And do you put a certain weight on a human study versus a different species?
If it's a good human study, you'd prefer to use it. But
any idea of the ratio of all the studies?
You know, off the top of my head, no, but there have been a lot of human studies, and they all have one or more limitations. It's just hard to do a human study. It just is. Yeah, these studies are very limited in their sensitivity to detect effects because of what's known as confounding other things that might impact the health endpoints that you're looking at, which is why a lot of our work defaults to the animal studies, because you can at least control the exposures of the animal studies. But there have been a lot of human studies. The C10 studies down in the southeast U.S., that's where the FE-associated testicular cancer and kidney cancer comes from, cholesterol impacts, and some of the other human impacts come from those studies. Philippe Grandjean in Harvard has done some studies in Faroe Islands. Those are the studies that document human effects on immune responses, reduced antibody titers, vaccinations, which are possibly clinically significant. Who you talk to. So there's a lot.
The number of studies are human studies, 10%, 20%, half?
PFOA, probably half. PFAS, maybe less. The other ones, much less. And the other thing to keep in mind in the human studies, most people aren't exposed to one of these things. We're exposed to a mix of them. So then you get into the problem of trying to differentiate whether or not the effects are associated with PFAS or PFOA. Statistical analysis becomes pretty complicated. Sorry. Oh.
How close are you on the background studies, what's currently present in the background?
We are not doing any sort of de novo studies ourselves, but we are aware of the Vermont study, and it will be something we'll be taking a close look at.
Do you have standards for the studies that you're using, or peer reviewed, or what's the quality control, I guess, on the studies that you're using?
So pretty much everything we're looking at are peer reviewed publications. So mean, that's sort of, if it's in the peer reviewed literature, we can find it. We're not getting access to any of the CBI, confidential business information. EPA might have under the COSTA program, we haven't seen any of that.
Hi, I'm Will Chater from Science Institute. I was wondering if your approach is considered the pharmacokinetic models that Minnesota recently issued. I noticed that you were using a lactating woman as a sensitive population, and their results suggested that infants may be the sensitive population to consider.
Yeah, and the answer to that is because we're using a relative source contribution of 20%, if you look at what Minnesota did, I think we're using 50, we think we would capture sufficient. I think we're protecting infant with the use of that 20%. So no, we haven't. And we could chat some more about modeling and what level of peak over the is concerned or not.
So, following up on that, does that mean that the new numbers do not include the NTP information about PFOA, chronic exposure, and pancreatic tumors?
It does not. All right. Once.
I know you mentioned the Vermont study for looking at background levels, just going back to his comment. Are you looking at anything else other than the Vermont study? Because I thought Vermont study mainly focused on the soil background level.
Yeah, mainly focused on the soil, and that's where we would start. Based on the UCMR3 data, most of water supplies don't have much of this, so it's probably not significant background in public water supplies. Private water supplies has impacts maybe situations where we have septic systems nearby. Certainly of interest, but we've not started looking at that.
Thank you.
Do you know if other states are, Clean Water Action, do you know if other states are going the UF route or whether or not they're looking at the toxicity studies instead?
It varies from state to state. I can't remember which is which, but some are doing one way, some are doing another. All right, thank you, everyone. Good. Hopefully we saved enough time for you.
Oh, yeah, sure. All right, so I'm Damon. I'm a senior analyst in the drinking water program, and we're going to kind of transition here from presentations about work we've already done or proposals we made in regulations to where we are on the drinking water side of things, which is we've not yet crafted a regulation. We're here looking for input, so hopefully we're going to have a little more conversation. We handed out through the email system a series of questions we hope you think about, and it includes topics along a broad range of ways that we craft the drinking water regulation. Looking for opinions, input, concerns you might have about different aspects of drinking water regulations. So, I'm going to just go through a series of slides. Your comments can be in whatever order you'd like them to be, but we thought we'd cover one slide per topic, give people a chance to sort of ruminate on that topic, if you will. I can also answer any questions you might have about the questions. If you're uncertain about what we're trying to get at here and what it might look like at the end of the day, I'm happy to talk about that. But I'll just basically pitch each slide and then look for input from the crowd. So obviously the first question we generally ask is, who should this MCL apply to? As we told you, there are 3 types of public water systems, and this is the federal model, so we follow it as does every other state. Communities, non-transient non-communities, and transient non-communities. And in general, we gave you examples of what that includes. Your town is a typical community, but it could also be a mobile home park you live in, or an apartment complex, a condominium. These are people live every day and their exposures are greatest. Non-transient non-communities are where the same people come back every day. The best example of that is a school that has its own well, but it's also businesses that have their own well and have more than 25 employees. Transient non-communities are all the other little guys, from the ice cream shops on Cape Cod to places in your communities where you might just stop in for coffee. And then there's also the availability of saying that the applicability could vary based on the size of the public water system. And typically what you see there is more of a staggered approach. The largest guys go first, the next year the next size, the next year the next size. it gives the smaller systems a little more time to figure out how to deal with what might be an immediate large cost event. And you also might vary based on the type of source water you're using to deliver water. Obviously, groundwaters that are underground are a little more protected than a surface water body that might take immediate runoff. So you might have different requirements for a groundwater system versus a surface water system. So with that, I'm going to open it up here on each topic for slides, but feel free to come back to it later if you have a thought later. Jen?
Okay, I have a sort of stepping back question, I hope. We're really trying to understand sort of the legal authority the DEP has to create your own MCL. Could you maybe speak to that?
Yeah, sure. So as we understand it under, well, I'll look at my attorney back in the room, 30A, I believe is the right relevant section of the state statutes. We can promulgate regulations under our general statutes that protect, in very broad terms, sources of drinking water. So that is our authority. All we are required to do is have the kind of public opportunity for comment on regulations, which would then allow us to react to that public comment.
In this slide, is MCL referring to Massachusetts?
Massachusetts.
Okay,
Yeah,
just want to be sure.
It's a slight distinction we make where there's not a federal parallel.
Okay.
And perchlorate is probably the best example. There's a Massachusetts MCL for perchlorate and currently no federal perchlorate MCL. Other concerns, questions? Steve?
How does this all fit in with the drinking water guidelines, which, from a practical perspective, have been treated as if they were immediately effective MCLs, but here, when we get to a regulation, we're talking about staggering?
Sure. So staggering is simply an option that we have. It's something the federal government has done as well, where you've got something that might involve significant capital investment necessary. So you give the smaller systems a little more time to figure out the financing. As it goes to how we use guidelines in Massachusetts, the current drinking water regulations already have authority for us to do on a case-by-case basis what's called an individualized health assessment. So we rely on the science that's done by the Office of Research and Standards to kind of have a starting point to know where could we be concerned to put that particular public water system into a health assessment. And so that's where our current authority can use a guideline that's not yet a promulgated standard. But it's on a one system at a time basis. Yeah.
Are there situations in the state of Massachusetts where transient non-community water supplies are required to test?
Yeah, they're required for the least amount of things because of the exposure.
Right.
But they do all the acute contaminants, so they do bacterial contamination, nitrate, nitrite, sodium, and we make them do perchlorate testing as well. If they were to use a certain treatment practice that has a potential acute byproduct, chlorine dioxide, they do subject to that part of the regulations as well.
And the transient non-community, that's daycare centers and community centers, right?
So it depends. So it's based upon how many people are served on an everyday basis. If the same people come back and those same people are 25 or more, they're actually non-transient. You have to think about this as places that have essentially like fewer than 25 employees and believe that different people come every day. So if a daycare center has 25 or more kids coming every day, they're not a transient non-community. Same thing with the community center, depending on what the staffing levels.
Okay, so where anything under 25 that you're not expected every single day, even if, what if they're 25 and they're different, that's transient?
So that makes them a public water system, 25 people a day, 60 days a year, but if it's different people, they're typically going to be a transient non-community system.
Okay.
Questions or concerns on applicability? Okay, and again, you can come back to it if it's later.
And also, in addition to coming back during today's conversation, you guys have all the questions. They're going to be here on the, posted on the slides. And the idea is that we have an extended window for sort of pre-rulemaking input. So loop back with us through that drinking water email at the last slide, and give us your thoughts on these or further questions about clarification on any of these.
And remember what Stephanie said, eventually we're going to propose a drinking water regulation. And if you see a proposal that either you are concerned about, or you feel it's not protective enough, or not applicable enough, you can comment during that regulatory process as well. So this isn't the end of the game here. Steve, and then...
Sure. To Jen's question, you referenced a law, and you said one of the only things you need to do is have a public comment period.
So Chapter 38 is basically the Administrative Procedures Act, and that tells the executive branch agencies how to promulgate regulations.
So my question is, are there any parallels to the EPA MCL process, when looking at costs and technologies?
The EPA MCL process is actually in the Safe Drinking Water Act statute.
Right.
So Congress told EPA, you shall follow these procedures.
Right.
The legislature in Massachusetts told us under 38, you shall follow these procedures.
Which is just the one?
It's different. Okay. I don't want to say it's the only obligation in 38. What I'm saying is that when we've been asked the question about do you have to do a formal cost-benefit analysis, do you have to promulgate an MCLG, we were not held to those requirements.
Right.
I just want to call attention to the fact that I know that the question of waivers for smaller water systems and different standards has a lot to do with the cost and affordability. And so I'm asking the question about what mechanisms, if any, DEP has at your disposal to encourage state action when it comes to going after polluters to cover the cost of cleanup, especially for those smaller water systems.
Sure. So some of that's under Locke shop, so not under the drinking water program, but we do work closely with the Bureau of Waste Site Cleanup. We typically will do, in conjunction with their staff, site discovery type activity, it's called, to figure out where is the contamination coming from. We try to then identify a potentially responsible party, if I have that acronym correct. Good, thumbs up, good. In which case then, those kind of cost recovery activities would take place under the Waste Site Cleanup program. Once you find a responsible individual or organization or entity, whatever you want to call it, they would potentially be on the hook for doing cleanup activities. And potentially also putting in a remedy that covers the drinking water source that's been impacted. We do see that across the state in this contamination and other ones. Yeah, sorry.
Do you see a need for a legislative effort to get some money allocated to the DEP for those smaller water systems that cannot afford the testing? Or is there a mechanism by which funding can be brought to the, to the smaller water supplies before, obviously the CERCLA process is a long and winding road, and people drinking poison should know as soon as possible. So is there something that we can help do to provide funding for the testing of smaller communities?
So I can't speak for the legislature. They have the ability to put forth bills that can cover any kind of support they feel is appropriate. What I can talk about is historic practices that we're aware of. The biggest mechanism that we have to provide support for all public water systems is probably the state revolving fund. This is actually federal funding that comes into every state that's been allowed to use for treatment typically, and those kind of activities rather than the standard monitoring and kind of things we're just starting to talk about here. So we typically don't see federal mechanisms to support routine activities like testing your water. That's not to say it isn't on the agenda for them to think about. I mean, there's a lot of bills for PFAS that are going on in both Congress. A lot of stuff being discussed in state legislatures as well, so I'm not going to try to predict what they might authorize to be expended. But certainly that's one thing we'd like to hear. We don't do a formal cost-benefit analysis, but understanding the cost to especially smaller public water systems is something we try to take into consideration. It's one of the reasons we look at applicability. If we were to tell, if we were understanding that the science tells us that maybe exposure at a transient in our community isn't as concerning as exposure in a community setting, maybe we could take them out of the regulation completely. We still wouldn't necessarily mean we wouldn't test at a public water system TNC. Sorry, I'm trying to do backwards. At a transient non-community system, but we wouldn't do it routinely. We would do it probably more on a site discovery type thing, where they're in an area known to be contaminated, and we pick up sampling there. So this gets into, started getting into the monitoring process a little bit. To frame it, we don't have to allow monitoring waivers. What we typically do in offering a monitoring waiver is take into consideration areas of the Commonwealth that simply have demonstrated no contamination. Historical test results show there's no contamination, and the sources are protected against activities which may contribute that contamination. And so that then becomes a cost saving for systems in those types of areas by reducing the monitoring requirements or potentially eliminating them in some of our waiver programs. These are typically renewable grants, so we do it, not a grant in terms of money, but a grant of a waiver is typically reviewed every 3 years. So we're looking at a situation in case land uses change, in case a new industry comes into play, in case we haven't been able to reduce testing during that 3 years and it shows detections, they'll lose their waiver. And so then now they're back on the normal monitoring program. Okay?
I know this can be a very emotional issue for some folks, some groups, but words do matter, and so I would just like to ask that we not use poison necessarily in this and talk about contaminants, because I think, you know, words can be sort of inflammatory, and the public is watching. It is a contaminant of concern. Let's just use it as that word and not poison, please.
Yes.
I guess I'm still stuck on the question of background, because if there really hasn't been, correct me if I'm wrong, has there been, you know, pretty good look at levels in groundwater in areas that we wouldn't expect, you know, based on land use, like I think Mark said, maybe more private wells are going to have an issue because they're near septic systems. There's plenty of public, you know, community systems near septic systems.
Yeah, so
I think you're going to find.
I can take it in pieces if you want. Right.
Well, let me just say, I feel like your map that you showed in the very beginning
Right.
with just a few red and orange dots, you know, is going to turn red all over the state. And even the larger or medium-sized community systems are going to have a very difficult time with the cost, real treatment, quickly, impact that cost on the rate. So, you know, it's just moving very fast and difficult for systems to qualify.
Yeah, so just to recap, how are we understanding background now and how many systems we anticipate would have an effect if we were probably getting MCL? To date, the only really closest statewide monitoring effort is the UCMR3. Only 171 public water systems in Massachusetts were actually required to test on the UCMR3 for PFAS. Most of them are in the eastern part of the state because it's population-based requirements. You have to serve over 10,000 people to be required to sample under UCMR3. EPA then picks 800 small guys nationally, and we have about a dozen in Massachusetts that were also included in UCMR3 sampling. It's one of the reasons why we're asked, and we did now send this letter out, suggesting voluntary testing. To help us understand, while we're in this process, how many more hotspots or contaminated areas we might find. The other concern is UCMR3 has less sensitive methods of testing. You know, depending on your combination of the PFAS in their UCMR3 monitoring, I think we figured out you could have as much as like 130 parts per trillion. You have to have the exact combination of those things to get that high. So you could have easily 20 or 30 of, I think it's PFOA was at 40, PFAS was at 30 or 20, somewhere in that range. So the numbers we're talking about now, especially with the MCP proposal, even our ORSP, aren't necessarily supported by UCMR monitoring. But this is also what we're talking about 6 years ago. So analytical techniques, laboratories, confidence in running these methods have gotten better. That's why we're hoping to do more monitoring as this process evolves. You know, we're asking the UCMR3 PWSs to go back to their labs because we've been told by some of the UCMR3 labs they actually ran them at a more sensitive level, and that data is available. We're hoping that can be captured as part of this effort. We're hoping more systems will do voluntary testing at today's sensitivity so we get a better sense of how many systems might be affected. But you're right, we really won't know until we do more comprehensive statewide testing, especially west of the Connecticut River. Not a lot of public water systems out there serve over 10,000, so they weren't part of UCMR3 monitoring. So we don't have a good sense of hotspots in that portion of the state.
And I'll just also add, everything Damon said is right on. And also, we are actively looking into what other states have done for broader sampling. So there are some states who have done more proactive sampling at a broader range of public water systems. So it's not Massachusetts, but it starts to paint a little bit of a picture about what is the background level in other states. So we're gathering that information now. If there's anything that anybody has got to share with us, that's certainly part of our considerations here. So New Hampshire has done pretty broad sampling. And I think Michigan, and we're in the process of gathering the information about who was sampled, for what compounds, what reporting limits and what were their findings. So we are trying to gather that just as an indicator of what some of the neighboring states are finding, beyond the UCMR3 data.
And it gives you a little bit better picture. I mean, in Michigan, every single community public water system in the state, they publish that on their webpage. They're doing all the NTNCs this year, so they're starting to get to the smaller guys. In that first round, they included schools, because the school had going well. They were concerned about exposing a public population. So it's a surrogate of the statewide measure. It's not the best one yet, because we haven't tested every public water system in Mass, but we're going to talk a little bit later that we still hope to do some targeted sampling in areas that weren't well covered by UCMR3, and maybe we're close to other known PFAS contaminations, but we haven't yet started that yet.
We're talking about background. It's great we're testing PWS and wet wells and things like that. But when I think about background, I'm looking at places that you're going to see what is the relevant existing PFAS, like rivers and streams that aren't near anything, or soil sites and things like that. That's going to give you the determination of what your background is. Is there any studies on that, like that? Would you be thinking about doing something like that so we can determine what actually is out there and then compare that to what's in water?
Yeah, so I think Mark mentioned that the Vermont soil study is probably the best one we've heard about in terms of looking at what is the quote-unquote background level that's out there in the environment right now. I don't think we've seen some statements from some of these states that have done broad-scale monitoring to get a sense of, well, there's not an immediately proximate contamination source, yet they're still seeing X amount. So either due through airborne deposition, traveling down through riverways and streams and such, you might get transported contamination from a site that's not obvious to you. We have at least one site, one of the public water systems we're tracking where we really don't have an obvious source of contamination yet. And the levels are not just at the 2 or 3 parts per trillion level. I think the last raw value I saw was in the 40s. So it's something's there, but we haven't found it yet. That's sort of a combination of waste site cleanup activities, the public water system themselves looking around the community, and getting a sense of how broadly these contaminants might spread through municipal waste handling or anything else that just spreads the common use of these chemicals around.
The other question I had is, are you going to restrict analytical to 537.1, or are you going to allow 537 modified?
So not 537 modified yet. We're sticking to the 2 published versions of 537 and 537.1. But we're looking for comments. Isotope dilution is being commonly used now to modify 537. I think EPA has hinted that they're close to actually publishing that as a new version, so obviously we would accept that. Our general practice is to accept EPA published methods or methods published by other method development organizations. But that individual modifications that are not within the scope of the method, this is where it gets a little complicated. The method allows you to modify some parts of the process, but not others. Modifying the parts you can't modify are things that we really can't be comfortable with, because we don't have the horsepower to do inter-laboratory comparisons to say, oh yes, that modification doesn't alter the quantification or what you're finding. That's really, we have to rely on the methods development organizations to do that.
One last, on certified labs, they are required to do
performance testing.
Thank you.
Yes. So we don't currently certify in Massachusetts. That regulation package you'll see is moving forward. What we're doing is, under the drinking water program, we actually have the authority to tell a laboratory you can or can't do work in Massachusetts. So that's the 6 laboratories we've approved to do work in Massachusetts. They're all certified by other agencies. In almost every case, it's another state, or it's a state acting under the National Environmental Laboratory Accreditation Program. So they've certified labs to do work across the country or in their state. And what we've done is we've accepted that certification to do work in Massachusetts. As we develop our own certifications and roll that out, we would then be more directly involved with our lab certification staff, looking at their performance tests, looking at their SOPs, looking at how they actually run the method, to ensure that we're as confident as the other state was who certified them. But yes, PTs are part of the requirement whenever we have a certification program. Yes?
Yeah, I have a couple questions, pretty much related to each other. One is clean up of site in the community that I live in. There's a large site that needs to get cleaned up. The estimate, I think, at 300,000 or something. It's an environmental justice community. And then, is there any way to get some funds for that? But also on top of that, how do you actually physically do that? I mean, it's a pretty large piece of area. And are there places for that to go to then? And
So, it's outside of drinking water, so I'm going to be a little bit out of my
I'm sorry.
But that's okay, I'll try.
Well, we're doing it to protect our drinking water.
Yes, absolutely. That's where my knowledge of these programs are there. So, under our waste site cleanup program, or under a federal Superfund site, we do have a couple Superfund activities going on right now. Either the Bureau of Waste Site Cleanup under the Massachusetts Contingency Plan, that's the MCP, or EPA under CERCLA will do an activity to clean up. And you heard Paul generally describe that process. CERCLA is very similar. They assess the site, they propose a remedy, and remedies can be things like removal of soil. It can be pump and treat systems, which actually dry out the contaminated water, treat it, and then they discharge clean water back into the aquifer. So those are the two I'm mostly familiar with. In terms of getting rid of the waste from that, we've looked into this question a little bit in drinking water because you've been asked, well, where do I put the carbon that we're using in my filter right now? And we don't have a real solid answer on that yet. Whether or not carbon regeneration systems, which heat up carbon to a high temperature to basically destroy the stuff that's stuck to it, if that's sufficiently robust to destroy PFAS, I can't answer right now. In terms of soil removal, I mean, my guess would be it goes to a place that doesn't allow any leaching through it, so it would be a hazardous waste landfill or something similar. I'm guessing on that.
I think they did have a hot spot and they brought some of it to Taunton or something, but what I'm hearing is that that's really limited. That was like that,
Yeah.
Went there 2 years ago.
Where you're looking
they don't want any more.
Right. When you're looking at a mobile set of compounds like PFAS that are going to leach into the groundwater, a pump and treat system is probably what you're looking at. You develop intercepting wells. So groundwater flows underground in a certain direction. And so you take capture wells that are at the edge of that plume and you pump out the groundwater, treat it, and then return the clean water back to the aquifer. So that's kind of the idea behind it.
They are doing pump and treat there also.
You also want to deal with the pollution prevention aspect. So you want to deal with the activity that's actually introducing. Paul mentioned that in his talk as well. You're looking to avoid the ongoing addition of more PFAS into the environment.
Yeah, we're getting polluted by another thing, and in some weeks on a Friday they'll say, "Oh, we're going to work together," and then like 2 weeks later, that is sort of, it seems to be clearing up at this point. I hope it does, because that's exactly what's needed is the work between. And the one last thing I was going to ask for is, are there other things like PFAS and other things that are on the horizon that might be like the next thing to...
So one of my contributions to an earlier question about how do we keep track of this kind of stuff, a number of us participate in multi-state and federal work groups on emerging contaminants. I participate in them. I know Paul does. I know Mark does. So between the dozens of us at MassDEP participate in these efforts, we tend to hear about and then start tracking other chemicals of concern. The drinking water process to actually regulate contaminants that was developed in the 1996 Amendments to the Safe Drinking Water Act allows for everything that, from like citizen nomination of concerns to industry usage. So in other words, volume of chemical being produced in the U.S. will trigger its look during the Safe Drinking Water Act reviews. So there's a number of different avenues whereby chemicals can be nominated for concern. But we also look for the research industries, the academic industries that are looking at, is there a health effect from this latest thing? Because everyone's using it in their cologne or something of that nature. So that's where 1,4-dioxane started getting interested in. MassDEP does have an emerging contaminants work group internally so that we do cross-bureau. So air and water and waste all talk together to say, what are you looking at? What are you seeing out of municipal landfills? What are you seeing in drinking water programs, especially in the unregulated monitoring efforts? So those are the sort of standing activities that exist and keep us in the loop.
And one example, if you look at the current rollout of the unregulated contaminant monitoring rule, and those substances that EPA is looking nationwide for frequency prevalence of those. So, for instance, there's a number of the cyanotoxins that come from hazardous algae blooms.
Yeah, and actually, in terms of public opportunities, EPA has a UCMR 5 webinar in about 3 weeks, I think. I have the date in my pocket, but it's on my emails. So, if you're interested, Google that. EPA, it's a publicly available meeting. It goes like all day. And I think it's just their opportunity to say, what is the concern to the public or other stakeholders that they want to consider putting into UCMR 5. So we talked a little about monitoring, but
so to get to your question or answer your question,
you have the answer now.
I mean, I think from the water supplier's perspective, there should be monitoring waivers and the ability to reduce monitoring requirements, because I think these are not inexpensive tests.
I mean, our estimate is about $500 per site if you want to test, and that's just one round.
One round, right? So.
Yeah, so I mean, and that plays a role in this. And the real thing we've learned over I've been here 25 years, monitoring waiver program can be very effective in screening out public water systems that should be monitoring at a more increased frequency and those where it's really not necessary because of more pristine sources, more robust source protection, no historical land uses or activities that have contaminated their supplies. And so we're able to really make these targeted regulations by offering things like monitoring waivers.
If that ends up being your process, one thing I just want to flag is because of the prevalence of PFAS in different materials like food packaging, like I've heard of a lot of cases of commercial composting businesses where you're taking PFAS coated food packaging, turning it into compost and transporting that all across the state. So I would just hope that as you determine where those waivers are appropriate, you're thinking about just the sheer magnitude of the problems of PFAS.
And that's the kind of thing we do take into consideration. In fact, even the existing monitoring waivers for the various compounds that we allow waivers now, the outcome of the waiver is different. Like for volatile organics, very common in commerce, dry cleaning fluids, think of those kind of things, gasoline products. We don't allow you to eliminate monitoring for VOC. We allow you to reduce it. Things like pesticides that are used on pineapples, we allow you to reduce that monitoring to almost zero because it's really not something you grow in Massachusetts. So that's how we sort of take into account prevalence and commercial use in Massachusetts specifically. Okay, I have a few more of these, so we'll just keep changing them, but again, you can take back. So the analytical question, you've heard it in the Mass Contingency Plan is asking for input on this. We are also going to be asking for input on this. You've heard a little bit of questions already starting to come into play here. Ultimately, when we pass the drinking water regulation, you need to have a reliable test method that enough laboratories can use so the public water systems that we're requiring to test can do the testing at these laboratories. And so ultimately what we're looking at here is how we structure the requirements. Is 20 parts per trillion really supportable with the existing methods and labs and the uncertainties in the analytical process? So that's where some of these questions are coming from. We're also making sure if anyone else has heard of new methods that are coming. I did mention that we were told EPA is supposed to publish a new method this summer. They said July, but we'll see. But that's really targeting additional small chain substitutes for the legacy long chain compounds. But again, in the concern about these are PFAS that are in the environment, that kind of methodology might also be useful for us to get a sense of continuing contamination. So questions, input on the analytical world?
So the same concern we had when we first rolled out perchlorate rule, where if we're thinking about 20 for 6, that these detection levels are awfully close. Typically, we like to see a bit more space so we have fewer false positives. We'll need to think a bit about, we need to be clear that we're thinking about confirmatory monitoring and how information rolls out so that we provide the public clear information about real results and not things which are so close to the edge that we're not sure we're really seeing what we think we're seeing.
Right. So give people a sense of what we're talking about here. A method can measure down to the signal-noise ratio. And once you get too close to that, which is the reporting limit, it gets unclear about what your quantity is in that result. Doesn't mean it's a bad test, it just means that you're right on the analytical limit of what you're able to measure. And so with 20 parts per trillion, laboratories right now measuring PFAS for us are measuring at about 2 to 3 parts per trillion limit. So you multiply that by 6 and you're at 12 to 18. So you're so close to what we're potentially going to introduce as a standard that there's uncertainty, and once you add them all together, that's really close to the limit where we're going to say you're in violation. So that's where we have to sort of get a look at what we call analytical feasibility. Is it really feasible to measure reliably the difference between a non-detect and a detect and say you've now violated the standard based upon this measurement?
Do we know the difference between the limit of detection and the limit of quantitation for each of the 6?
Yeah, they're almost all the same. What we're seeing is, the analytical practices, the reporting limit is actually the limit of quantitation.
Okay.
So 2 to 3 is where the laboratory says they're confidently able to quantify what they're seeing. What we're also getting, though, is laboratories are reporting to us, it's there, but we can't quantify it.
Right.
So you get this kind of like a blip on your radar. And how we deal with those blips is something that we have to figure out if we're going to stay at this low level.
Do you have, sorry, just
Yeah,
on that,
please,
do you
go
have,
ahead.
do you have any thoughts yet on how you handle that?
So we're getting data now, obviously. In the clear-cut cases where we're getting detections above a minimum reporting level, it's straightforward. We're using those to sum up 5, compare against the ORSG on a site-by-site basis. My own thoughts on detections that are there but not quantifiable is we deal with black and white numbers in the drinking water program in terms of non-compliance with the numeric standard. So it's a little hard to take that uncertainty into that certain outcome. So we might think about using it for other purposes. Like you're getting a real detect, so maybe we keep them on increased monitoring. But these are all just my thoughts. We're not writing regulations yet, but we're looking for input on if you have thoughts about how we might use the less than MRL, but it's there but not quantifiable. Yes?
Do these methods take precursors into account, or
So
not at all?
the 2 methods right now for drinking water just have 14 PFASs and the 18 PFASs. I don't believe any of these are the telomeres and those kind of things that are precursors. 537.1 added some of the Gen X compounds and I think maybe another one of the short chain ones. The new method we're told is coming out is taking a lot more of the smaller PFAS compounds into play, but I haven't seen yet a published drinking water method that takes into consideration the precursors. Doesn't mean people aren't measuring them. It's just not necessarily standardized practice yet. Okay. I'm going to like wait the time taking too long. So compliance with treatment, obviously once we've done some applicability and we've done some testing, we have to know whether or not you're in compliance with the maximum contaminant level or not. We also have to know about what types of treatment we might require you to put in place or is available to put in place. So we're looking for input on technologies that are out there. This is again part of the opportunity for you to keep us in the loop on stuff that you might be aware of that we're not. To introduce the first bullet a little bit more, we talked about this briefly in the April 11th meeting. We're kind of landing on calling PFAS a subchronic contaminant, so we're not talking about 1 day exposure causing an adverse health effect, but we're also not talking about 70 years causing an adverse health effect. And so how you determine non-compliance with the numeric standard is probably going to be different than the 2 obvious examples we have now in the regulations. Today, if you have an acute contaminant, 1 sample with confirmation, you're out of compliance. If you have a chronic contaminant, it's usually a running annual average, so you take a year's worth of monitoring, 4 quarters, you average them together, and you figure that against the numeric standard. In this case, we're probably looking at a shorter time exposure of concern, so we'd probably be looking to craft something else. Maybe a monthly running annual average, but maybe not on an annual basis, maybe on a quarterly basis. So, we're going to have to probably play with the little ideas, put it out for public comment, ultimately in the regulation, and make sure it's understandable to both the regulated community and the public.
And you have some trade-off on cost.
Yeah, absolutely. When we make a determination that a public water system is out of compliance with an MCL, they have to take a remedy. Now, that could be taking a well offline, but it could also be having to install treatment, which now is incurring a cost.
I'm just thinking monitoring. If you're talking about monthly, if you're talking about averaging months, you're now talking about a lot more samples per year.
Yeah, you can't do that if you don't put people on monthly. So I don't mean to propose anything at this point. I'm just suggesting that you would do a different calculation.
Looking at just doing testing on finished water or
Yeah.
raw?
So MCL compliance is based on public exposure. So this is entry point sampling of what's being delivered to the public. It doesn't mean you wouldn't necessarily require public water systems to take additional samples. That's part of the site discovery activities we try to get into to help them understand the source of their contamination. And again, you're welcome to send stuff in at another time. You know, we're definitely interested in technologies that you've heard are successfully being applied in other parts of the country. We don't have a lot of unique examples in Massachusetts of treatment that's being put on place. You know, carbon is the most common. There's some resins being discussed. There's some small scale under-the-counter reverse osmosis that's available. Whether or not that's really applicable to a large public water system doing it kind of depends. You've got a pretty concentrated waste stream on a reverse osmosis system, so you probably have a waste problem at that point. But those are the kind of questions we need to explore with any technology suggested for what's called the best available technology.
Given that you're seeing cases where certain PFAS compounds with technically fewer carbons actually have a longer half-life, are you going to be paying more attention to, because my understanding is most treatment technologies spend a lot of time focusing on filtering out long-chain PFAS, and so are you going to be paying more attention to quote-unquote shorter-chain PFAS, given that they might actually have, in some cases, a longer half-life?
Yeah, I mean, in the drinking water program, we start with the science that comes from the Office of Research and Standards. So, as you heard, moving toward PFAS, which is the 4-carbon version, is next on the list. So, as we either adapt the MCL, or if that work were to complete before we complete our process, the MCL could be either a separate MCL for short chain, or a chain. So, I'm not ruling out anything. What we're really looking at right now is likely to be a similar proposal than with the MCP. So you get the 6 long-chain legacy compounds. The substitutions that are short-chain compounds, and even some of the older short-chain compounds, we don't yet have enough toxicology data to say, oh, we should regulate, this is how we should build that regulation.
So,
Steve?
I was on a meeting recently and someone raised a question for another state about whether they were thinking about like the larger environmental trade-offs around greenhouse gas production, about using more carbon, having to regenerate, particularly when we're down at these single-digit nanograms where you're going to have to regenerate a lot in many wells because you're going to be capturing a lot of other contaminants. Is that part of the DEP process, or is it part of the EEA process? It's part of our larger goals.
Right. It's certainly something that we are open to receiving during the public comment process. As Paul said, very detailed comments like that are great during the regulatory process comment, because then we can say, oh, in fact, EEA and the department are very interested in climate goals. So are we actually creating something that's going to cause a balancing act that has to be performed?
So I'm happy to, switch to using persistent bioaccumulative toxic carcinogens, but that's really long. But I'm happy to do that if that's what I need to do. I am concerned that this compliance and treatment does not include the mention of using an alternative PFAS-free water supply if it's available. And the reason I bring this up is that we are an AFFF contaminated community, both through the National Guard, which is a state agency, technically speaking, and through our own city, which, yay. But the thing about it is that the foam that we received from DEP that they identified as coming from Joint Base Cape Cod, when UMass took a look at it, had over 300 different PFAS in it. And so while I'd really love to be non-detect for 6, I'm worried about the other 290 something.
Sure.
And I am wondering whether or not there is a way in this compliance and treatment and the whole treatment train. I'm wondering if not giving us PFAS water could be number 1 on the list.
So absolutely. There's nothing that says in the drinking water regulations you have to install treatment on your existing source. Having an alternative source, whether that means purchasing from a regional system, a neighboring system, or drilling new wells or identifying new reservoirs, is always an option. When we sit down with a public water system that's in non-compliance with an MCL, we don't say, so what's your treatment option? We say, what are you considering to deliver water that meets our standards? And so it's a performance requirement. They have to do something, like a remedy solution in wayside cleanup, to deliver to the public water that meets the standards. Now that could be pristine new source. There aren't a lot of communities that have the ability to find that pristine new source in their town boundaries. So, they could look to regionalization, they could look to neighboring purchases, they could look at different things. Oftentimes, treatment is usually the lowest cost, easiest way to do that right off the bat.
Right, well, my point is that since the treatment that our city has chosen does not address those other hundreds of compounds,
right.
And we can't monitor for them at this point.
Right.
Is there an option to make the preferential, if it's available, the elimination of PFAS in our public water supply?
Well, just, what we're doing is we're seeking input, pre-rule making input on what the rule could look like. That is input that's very useful. Like, could we consider, I don't think there's precedent for it in our drinking water program now, but there's PFAS is different with this large group of family that we know very little about,
right.
and some presumptions that could be made about they travel together, and also some information that indicates that treatment itself can result in other compounds certainly passing through, but also maybe being generated. So I hear you that this is a suggestion about could the rule be structured that way to actually have preference for the remedy.
Yeah.
And the preference being find an alternate source.
Yeah.
So whether statutorily we're prohibited from that, or I would go to Damon, but I hear you that's a suggestion.
Yeah, and I shouldn't have dove in too much on a remedy. Yeah, obviously we're looking for input here. So if the input is, we'd like to see the rule consider the possibility of, because of the broad range of what might be in the water, not only focusing on the 6 that may be in the proposed MCL, but rather let's look at an alternate source.
But I just don't understand, sorry to chime in, but what does it mean to have PFAS-free water? How do we even know? How would we ever know that?
Basically, you're limited by analytical technology.
Right.
So all you can say is that at this point, in addition to the 6 that we might regulate, you've got 12 more and that's 537.1.
But
so
which is, we know, scratching the surface potentially.
Absolutely, yeah. So I'm only up to 18. I'm nowhere near 3,000, 5,000, whatever it might be. This is by no means to say we have certainty here.
I just don't want to chase the phantom. I'm just thinking out loud about. I think you're right, and then I'm also thinking like, what is the way to propose? What is the way for us to chime in as advocates to ask for something that's doable and meaningful?
There's an opportunity later to comment in this meeting today on future technology for the classic PFAS. We know that was the petition. We made a decision not to go that route, but we're still open to getting input on a class type regulation, which would be more broadly spoken, outside of what you can measure.
And what you're referring to is a petition that was filed by CLF and Toxic Action Center to have it be a class of much broader than just the.
Yeah, Doug will introduce that after this section. So we'll get into a little more detail of what the petition was and what our decision was, and then how we're still looking for input on that.
And I guess I would say, given the available analytical methods to go with an approach like what Kristen was talking about, it'd be a preference as a remedy. It would be a preference for a raw water, for source water that had no detection of any of those that are in the existing method 537, 537.1. So you wouldn't be guaranteed PFAS free because we don't have testing methodologies for the 3,000 plus. But we do have certified, approved methodologies for the, how many are in 537, 537.1? 14 and 18. So that could be the way the rule could be structured, is my point.
Yeah, and there's nothing that says as more analytical processes come out, that kind of a structure could be built in to say, as capability expands, so does the rules concern. But like Doug said, there's not a lot of precedence for that in the existing Safe Drinking Water Act-based rules, but doesn't mean we can't think about that. Is there a question about it?
I just wanted to make a comment. There shouldn't be left an impression that all these other PFAS compounds automatically pass through carbon. There are data sets being built across the Commonwealth that show at least we're monitoring for 23, and typically see 13 or 14, and they're all non-detect.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think that's something we want to make sure is part of this discussion and part of the conversation as we craft the rule is that, you know, it's not a given that certain PFASs do go through carbon and certain PFASs do not. So it's a very useful comment. Yes?
I guess I just want to make a comment. I mean, worked with public water systems now for 25 years, and it's very rare that a system is going to have an alternate source.
Right.
Pristine, and they can just switch it on. If they did, they would have already had it on. You know, to get a new source developed and tested, permitted, built, 10 years, easy.
Yeah, and you know, I did hope I would get that point across when we were discussing this. But yeah, it's not easy to put a new source in, especially within the boundaries of your town. And you don't know what you're going to get until you're going to build a test well and you start looking at the
Or even regionalization or connecting, you know, to another array, you know, very expensive. A lot of time. People need to understand the complexities in that.
So the last slide on this sort of topics was notification costs. We've touched on costs on and off, but the last piece of a regular rule will be notification triggers. Typically, you've got notifications both to MassDEP and to the public, and they may or may not always be in the same triggers. So we're also open to conversations about, you know, how much do you want a public water system to let the public know versus let the public know, or any other types of intermediary kind of triggers. Just to put it in some context, you know, the consumer conference report rule doesn't change on this regulation, so any detections of regulated contaminants are always going to be in the annual report. So that wouldn't change as we add new MCLs. You still get that kind of notification. If they violate an MCL, there's almost always a public notification trigger for that, so you get public notification for violating the MCL. But we're open to conversations about other notification requirements that, you know, would be important to the community. And then cost, I just put in all the other topics under this. So if there's anything we didn't cover under cost that you'd like to discuss now, either on, you know, the cost of monitoring, the cost of compliance, the cost of treatments, or anything else in that nature. Yes?
I think, building upon your comments about water supply here, I don't have a firm sense that we have our arms around the scope of the problem in Massachusetts. 351 towns, groundwater primarily the supply. And I'm wondering what the DEP and the state is doing in terms of studies of background, because the scope of the problem is going to inform solutions and regulation. Now, we don't have a requirement for a regulatory impact analysis, but we need to know what the scope of the problem is so water suppliers have a sense, can we go for alternative supply, or do we really have a background issue here that is everybody's going to have to wrestle with? And I think of the small towns in the Berkshires that are located on sandy deposits in bedrock valleys that are vulnerable. So I guess my question to DEP is, what sorts of vulnerability assessments are you doing using land use studies, MassGIS, and so forth?
Yeah, so
and then just random testing
right.
of groundwater. It doesn't have to be a public supply or a private. It's just random testing across the state to look at the scope.
So I'll start with randomization then. The voluntary testing requirement is probably the closest we're going to get to randomized testing. Potentially, some of the labs will be able to provide UCMR3 data back to a public water system that asks for it to get a little more sensitivity down to get the better measurements. The first map will be on our webpage tomorrow, I think. You'll see all the UCMR3 participants. So coverage is, obviously I said, worse west of the Connecticut River, but it's pretty good in the rest of the Commonwealth. We're getting some testing through just voluntary efforts before that letter went out, and the public water system is sharing with us. The wastewater cleanup program, when they go into an area that has private wells, we'll be testing those resources as well. So we're getting, not a municipal or large public water system type measurement, but we're getting potentially a shallow, vulnerable private well. We have a targeted public water system testing proposal that's still working its way through discussions here at MassDEP. There's a bullet point coming up on that.
Okay.
But it's a little bit more along the lines of trying to trace back the hotspots still. We're not really proposing anything yet where we would go out or we'd ask systems to just randomly test in areas where we don't think that there's a concern. the idea and the understanding behind the sources of PFAS is still evolving. One of the reasons we participate in these multi-state efforts is because other states are doing targeted sampling and then telling us where they found the source of contamination. So we're sharing that information internally here to look at things like, Rhode Island's sweep through their state, not this year, but last year, found the fire department contaminated its own well from AFFF. So just handling that material basically drained out into the street. New Hampshire's doing an extensive amount of targeted sampling of different things. Vermont's doing some targeted sampling. So we came up with some of this understanding about the cleaning products being used in schools that brings stuff to janitorial equipment. That could be a contributing source to their own septic system and thereby to their own drinking water source. So as those understandings of land uses that are contributing PFAS to the environment continues to grow, so does our look at places where we think it might happen. One of the reasons why we decided to make every new source test for PFAS in the Commonwealth is exactly that question. We don't know what might be the land use to say, this is going to be a PFAS source, this is not. And so to help us evolve that, we're testing these almost random. It's not a high volume amount of testing. It's probably been a dozen new sources this year.
Yeah, it's the dry wells in communities that don't have collection systems that I'm concerned with. Car washes, other septic systems, just the scope of the problem in those areas, and people may be on small supplies or their own supply, but
we've done some GIS analysis based upon the known sources so far, and that's how we've actually developed some of the targeting we wanted to do in the Commonwealth.
Maybe a consideration might be to talk to DCR and USGS about their groundwater well monitoring network, and as an option for looking at background, take some tests out of those.
Yeah,
they're supposedly like near natural.
We're actually the staff that does that, the evaluation of those wells.
You see,
we go out on behalf of USGS and look at water levels.
So it could be an opportunity.
It could be an opportunity, yeah, absolutely.
New England data is great to share because the geology, hydrogeology in New England's very similar, right? That's all useful database. But Massachusetts probably has the greatest GDP of all the states, 16 times the size of Vermont in terms of GDP. And we're looking at Vermont studies and others, and I think we need to take some leadership and develop the studies that the others can draw on. Sure. And because we're taking leadership and regulation, let's do the background research as well. That's my feeling.
Sure, no, thank you.
The sources that you just talked about when you're gathering information and hearing about things like cleaning products, is that getting shared back to anybody so that the prevention can strive?
Yeah, so the multi-state activities, the outcomes of that are being shared with EPA. A lot of times the kind of pollution prevention activities are at the federal level. We've done that in some other emergent contaminant activities as well, where we found evidence of where the contamination came from, and at the federal level they can work with the manufacturers more easily than we can work from one state perspective, but that's about the amount of sharing we're able to do at this point.
So you can't sort of issue a, I don't know, free municipal services or someone that say that, hey, communities, you have a well, be careful of these things?
Oh, well, we are doing that. So we communicate with all public water systems, including the small ones that might be using products that through their own septic systems are going to contaminate their own wells. So yes, we are doing some of that type of direct communication with public water systems, including the small ones.
We have another group here at DEP that focuses on waste products and products in general. Long history of looking at mercury-containing products, for example. So they are now getting involved in this whole process. I would expect that there would be opportunities and initiatives to try to do what you are suggesting in the near future.
That's my last slide. If anything that we went over earlier you want to ask another question about before we pass it on?
Well, I piggybacking on what Kirsten said, I think that given the complexity of managing public water supply these days, there is certainly the MCL process, but the MCL process should also consider the other regulatory issues that are impacting water systems, like Water Management Act and constraints on withdrawing from certain supplies because of, Water Management Act permit conditions, or Interbasin Transfer Act regulations. If you're looking at a regionalization option, to understand the full scope, you kind of need to look at all of the regulatory pieces that impact
absolutely.
Water supply.
Anything else? All right, I'll pass it over to Doug.
Okay, hello. All right. So we did want to touch a little bit on the on our ongoing information gathering and openness to information about a treatment technique approach for the entire class of PFAS. So just a little, what have I done now? So just a little background on this topic. So as came up earlier, late last year, the DEP did get a petition from the Conservation Law Foundation and Toxics Action Center, and the petition was a petition for rulemaking to establish a treatment technique drinking water standard for PFAS. And what that petition basically asked for was ask DEP to establish a treatment technique standard for the entire class of PFAS, and it also urged as an interim step to adopt what at that time was Vermont's health advisory at 20 parts per trillion for the 5 long-chain compounds, and also asked at a minimum that DEP promulgate an MCL for the PFAS for which we have toxicity information and analytical information. So as people know, we are going forward with the MCL process right now, and we're looking at, we've built upon the Vermont approach and added one additional compound in. In our response to that petition, we said we continue to be open to additional information on toxicity, on analytical methods, on treatment technology, on costs associated, and that's a lot of what we talked about today, but this is also beyond the 6 long-chain compounds that we're currently proposing in the MCP regulations, but for the entire family or broader compounds beyond those 6 that we're currently looking at. So what we want to do today was have a short forum for anyone to identify any new information in any of these areas, new toxicological information, new studies. We'd already mentioned that earlier today about how anyone watching today, any of the stakeholders, when you get that additional information, make it available to us. But we did want to have at least a placeholder today for hearing any additional information you want to point us to. Can't do a deep dive on it today, but if you point us to information, we can then follow up, get the details, and consider that as we look beyond, still continue to look beyond the 6 compounds that are in the MCP draft, at any other compounds in the full class. So that would include new toxicological information, more information on how a treatment technique would actually be implemented in terms of what would trigger it and what kind of treatment would be required, which public water systems would be subject to it if there were such a thing, and laboratory capacity for compounds beyond what's in method 537 and 537-1. And also additional information on treatment technologies that are known for PFAS removal and destruction and costs associated. So with that, we'll just open it up. If anyone wants to point us, identify some additional information, point us to it now. You can mention it, flag it. But then also we've got our again, the last slide will have the email address where we just welcome any additional information, references that you can point us to. So we'll start with Kristen.
Last week, Linda Bergeron said to the PFAS, the second National PFAS Conference, that if looking at rat studies, pancreatic tumors begin showing up very, very early, and an appropriate MCL for PFOA would be 0.1 parts per trillion. That data goes with the study. It is not published yet, but the statistical analysis is out, as is the summary, which is what I just handed you.
Great, thank you. Anybody want to point to anything else? And again, this will be an ongoing process, so we continue to be to really welcome any additional info you can give us. Okay. So now we're just going to, we're going to do a quick wrap up. I think Stephanie and I might do this together. Or should I start? Okay, good. So as Paul said, the comment period on the proposed groundwater cleanup standard and soil standard is, the comment period closes on July 19th. Damon referenced our targeted public water supply sampling. So we're still developing what that approach is going to look like, but I would suspect that would be rolling out in the near future, and we'll have a chance to communicate more with this group about our plans for that. We are also considering, as Mark said, we're considering revising the ORSG, which again, we're looking at what comments come in on the MCP draft and considering whether it is appropriate to make a revision to the Office of Research and Standard Guidelines, given that we're considering the MCP rule and then also now in the process of looking at, committed to developing an MCL. David mentioned briefly this question about what disposal and management guidelines there should be for treatment media that has been saturated with the PFAS, so carbon or other media after it's been used and it's spent, how do you dispose of it? So we are wrestling with that, and we're also looking very closely at what other states and other jurisdictions are coming up with that. We will be coming out with a proposed rule for lab certification for PFAS so that we can do our own certification of state labs. Right now we're just doing a reciprocal, relying on other third-party certifications, and you can expect that in the fall of 2019. And right now we're targeting to be able to come out with a proposed drinking water rule by the end of 2019. So starting the formal rulemaking process. Stephanie, is there anything else I should say about next steps?
I think you covered it well, Doug. I think, as been emphasized throughout the discussion today, we've got excellent input today. We've got excellent input at the first meeting and then in between, and that can continue to be a rolling process. And I think sort of one question on our mind, we went into this meeting thinking, we're not sure if the group will decide that we need to have another meeting as this stakeholder group, or is the next step sort of this continual sort of iterative exchanging of information and the department going and developing the rule and then going through the formal rulemaking process, which is the full public process. So I think we're open on that point. I think we feel urgency, as we know all of you do, to move this process along, but at the same time we want to make sure that we are engaging and considering all the factors that you all are suggesting that we look at, if we're not already. So people can, you don't have to answer that question today, but we can stay open on that point too. And clearly, as we're going into the summer months, if we were to have another meeting, it would be in the fall.
Steve. So MCP comments are due July 19th.
That's right, yeah.
And you have people that found the MCC proposed anticipated end of this year. When's the anticipated MCP regulation?
That would likely be in the fall.
So the question is, when would we likely see a final MCP promulgation that would include the PFAS standard? And so we're thinking fall 2019.
Right, and again, as we've talked about, the information, the PFAS information that comes through that process is being considered in this process too. So they're very much connected.
And our intention is, as we're because we're going to be diving in on the MCL development, that will be the first slice of the MCP comments that the drinking water program is looking at, and that the Office of Research and Standards is looking at, is the PFAS comments. Meanwhile, there are, as Paul said, there are a number of other components of the draft MCP package, so they have to wrestle with all that, but sort of job one for drinking water and for the Office of Research and Standards to dive into the PFAS comments that we're getting. Jen?
So you would put out the proposal but then there's the comment period. And so I'd like to just ask that you have an extended comment period as you have under MCP so that our members have full time to evaluate the proposed regulations.
Good. Thank you for the comment. Okay.
And certainly, we will continue to keep this group updated on our rulemaking. So when we make it available, what all the hearing schedule, the comment schedule, and that you're sort of on our mailing list now, so no matter what you're hearing about what we're doing.
Next one question.
Yes.
The RSG revision, if you were to do that, how soon would you do that?
So at this point, that's just under consideration. So that's an if, and the when would come after that. So.
Right. It would be nice to know when. Would that be after the public comment period or after?
We would definitely be looking at the comments that come in through the MCP public comment process. And then we would also definitely keep this group informed if we're going to be going forward with an RSG in advance of the MCL. Acronym sitting here.
Right, because just to sort of finish that out, because once we have the MCL, then the RSG is no longer needed. So it's also a timing issue.
Well,
yeah, I just have two questions. One, I was wondering if the letter that you sent to Public Water Supply is asking them to ask their lab to report back to them the UCMR3 data. Is that letter available? I think it would be a nice model for other states to use. On the website?
Yeah, it is posted to our PFAS.
And then my second
All the
question.
letters are.
Okay, great. And then the second question, I know Maine has started a program where they're testing biosolids that could be land applied for PFAS. Are you guys considering anything like that?
So we did put in place, January of this year, we put in place a requirement for sampling of biosolids as part of either new application for a land application or the renewal process. So we are currently doing that as part of our either new or renewals.
In regards to the biosolids or residuals, given the fact that residuals from drinking water and wastewater are different, are you considering separating the two from the same sort of regulation that they're under? This doesn't seem to make sense to keep regulating residuals from an iron and manganese treatment plant in the same way as an industrial wastewater facility.
In terms of testing requirements?
Yes. Or even they're right now they're under the same regulation. Is there any thought to separating the two and having two subsets? Just because what's in a wastewater treatment facility coming out of its alcohol is going to be very dramatically different from backwash water from an iron and manganese system. And it doesn't seem feasible to continue to have the same testing requirements in both.
And do those, so the question is, are we going to look at and regulate residuals from all types of processes the same way, whether it's industrial processes, wastewater treatment facilities, or drinking water?
Well, you do now.
And we do now. We consider something different, splitting something off. So that's something that you should, that if you have suggestions on that, we would welcome that. But right now, in terms of testing for land application, it's the same for all residuals.
And we're looking at that issue.
And we are looking at that issue. Okay. So before we wrap up, I will just remind folks that today's PowerPoints and the video from today are all going to continue to be available where we're housing all of our information about PFAS and drinking water standard development. So the link is here on the website, but if you just go to the DEP website and put in the search bar, drinking water standard PFAS, you will get to this landing page and you'll be able to see all this information. And then I've referenced a couple of times the email address for submitting any ongoing comments about MCL development on the drinking water side, MCL development, or consideration of a treatment technique for the entire class. And I'll just read that email address, but again, you'll be able to see it on our website. It's program.director-DWP as in drinking water program @mass.gov. And in your subject line, please put PFAS MCL so that we know what you're commenting on. So with that, I'm going to hand it to Stephanie for closeout.
Yeah, I would just say thank you very much for your time, for your attention, for all the feedback that you've given us, that you will continue to give us, and our commitment to you is to stay in touch and we'll be working very hard on this issue. Thank you very much.
good one. See you soon, Joe.
Well, so